Nothing cuts deeper than arriving somewhere you have never been and knowing before a single word is spoken that you are already unwelcome. The afternoon sun hung low over the Montana mountains, painting the ridgeline in shades of copper and rust as the stagecoach pulled into the single-street town center of Silver Creek. Dust rose behind the wheels in a slow column that drifted across the weathered wooden buildings like a burial shroud settling over the shoulders of the dead. The year was 1873. Silver Creek was a frontier settlement carved from wilderness by stubborn hands and iron will. A cluster of timber-frame buildings lined the main road, a general store with a sagging porch, a saloon where piano music leaked through swinging doors even at this early hour, a church with a crooked steeple that leaned slightly eastward as if straining to hear the prayers of those who had stopped believing. And beyond the town, scattered homesteads stretched into the mountain valley like seeds thrown by a careless hand, each one a small defiance against the vast indifference of the land. The stagecoach lurched to a stop and the driver set the brake with a grunt that carried no feeling. He had been driving this route for 11 years and had long since stopped noticing the beauty of the mountains or the loneliness of the people who lived beneath them. The door opened and Emiline Whitfield stepped down with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make herself as small as possible. She was 21 years old, beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel against the rough backdrop of the frontier, as if God had made a mistake and placed a porcelain figure in a world built from iron and mud. Her skin was pale and fine, untouched by the sun that browned every other face in Montana territory. Her eyes were large and cornflower blue, holding equal measures of intelligence and fear, the kind of eyes that saw too much and said too little. Honey blonde hair escaped from a modest updo, soft tendrils, curling at her temples and along the delicate line of her jaw. Her navy blue traveling dress told a story of its own to anyone who cared to read it. The fabric was quality, the cut fashionable, the lace at the collar and cuffs the work of skilled hands. But the hem had been mended with thread that did not quite match. A faded spot on the left sleeve marked where a stain had been scrubbed too aggressively. The small cameo brooch at her throat was the last piece of jewelry she owned, and she wore it not for beauty but for armor, a reminder that she had once been someone worth adorning. In one hand, she carried a small leather trunk containing everything she possessed in the world. In the other, she clutched a letter so worn from reading that the creases had nearly cut through the paper. Three brothers seek honest, hard-working woman for marriage and homestead partnership. Must be willing to endure mountain winters, isolation, and honest labor. Good character, essential. Inquire Hawthorne Ranch, Silver Creek, Montana territory. Emiline read it one final time, her lips moving silently over words she had memorized during the long journey from Philadelphia. She had chosen this advertisement from dozens of similar ones, not because it promised comfort or romance, but because Silver Creek, Montana territory was the farthest place from Philadelphia she could find. Far enough she had prayed during every mile of the journey that her father's name might not have traveled before her. She was wrong. The stagecoach driver heaved her trunk to the ground with unnecessary force. He was a thick man with tobacco-stained teeth and the permanent squint of someone who spent his life staring into distance and dust. He leaned down from his seat, and his voice carried the casual cruelty of a man delivering bad news he does not personally care about. "Whitfield, is it?" He spat a stream of brown juice into the dirt. "You might want to keep that name to yourself around here, miss. Word travels faster than coaches in this territory." The words hit her like the first stones of an avalanche, not because they were unexpected, but because she had allowed herself during the final hours of the journey to hope that this time might be different, that this place buried so deep in the mountains that even God might have trouble finding it would be beyond the reach of her father's disgrace. Emiline lifted her chin and met his eyes with a dignity that cost her everything she had left to spend. The driver shrugged. Not his problem. He snapped the reins and the stagecoach lurched away, leaving her standing alone on the wooden platform with the Montana mountains looming above her like silent judges who had already reached their verdict. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the sky pressing down on her shoulders. Then she straightened her spine, adjusted her grip on the trunk, and turned to face the town that would either save her or finish the work that Philadelphia had begun. To understand the depth of Emiline Whitfield's isolation, you must first understand the crime that created it. 6 months before she stepped off that stagecoach in Silver Creek, her father, Henry Whitfield, federal land surveyor, for Montana Territory had been arrested, tried, and hanged for treason against the United States government. The charges were devastating in their specificity. Over a period of 3 years, Henry had allegedly sold confidential government survey maps, military supply route plans, and settlement defense layouts to the Cartwright Gang, the most feared outlaw band operating in the Northern Territories. The evidence presented at trial had been overwhelming. Documents bearing Henry's official surveyor's seal were found in the possession of captured gang members. Witnesses, fellow surveyors, and government clerks testified that they had seen Henry meeting with known gang associates in remote mountain passes and abandoned mining camps. A strongbox hidden beneath the floorboards of his office in Helena contained gold coins that the prosecution claimed were payment for his betrayal. 3 settlements along the northern supply route had been raided using information that could only have come from official survey maps. 17 people died in those attacks. Families burned in their homes. Children left orphaned on the frontier. The trial lasted 4 days. Henry Whitfield denied everything, even as the evidence mounted around him like walls closing in. He claimed the documents were forged. The witnesses coerced the gold planted by hands he could not identify. But Federal Circuit Judge Cornelius Drake, a man whose reputation for thoroughness and fairness was known throughout the territories, had pronounced him guilty on all counts. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out within the week. Henry Whitfield was hanged at Fort Ellis on a Tuesday morning in early spring when the mountains were still white with snow and the air carried the false promise of new beginnings. Emiline, then 20 years old, stood in the crowd because she could not bring herself to look away, because she owed her father the dignity of being witnessed in his final moments, even if the rest of the world had already turned its back. The rope creaked under his weight. The crowd murmured with the satisfied disapproval of people who believe justice has been served. And Emiline Whitfield inherited nothing but shame. In the months that followed, the consequences cascaded like dominoes pushed by an invisible hand. The family home in Helena was seized by federal marshals. Her mother's grave, her mother had died of scarlet fever when Emiline was 12, became a place she could no longer visit without enduring whispered accusations from other mourners who somehow felt entitled to guard the dead from a traitor's daughter. Her grandmother's herbal medicine practice, the craft Emiline had spent years learning with patient hands, and a hungry mind dissolved overnight as patients refused to be treated by someone whose blood was supposedly poisoned with treachery. The few friends she had maintained quietly stopped calling, stopped writing, stopped acknowledging her existence with the thorough efficiency of people who have decided that kindness is too expensive when reputation is at stake. Emiline sold everything she could: her mother's wedding ring, her grandmother's leather-bound books of herbal remedies, each page annotated in the old woman's careful hand, her own modest wardrobe, dress by dress, until she was left with 2. She used the money to pay her father's legal debts and fund her escape westward, answering the mail order bride advertisement, not with romantic hope, but with the desperate pragmatism of a woman who understood that her choices had narrowed to 2: marriage or destitution, a stranger's homestead or the streets of a city that had decided she did not exist. What she did not know, what she could not have known, as she stood alone on that platform in Silver Creek, watching the dust settle behind the departed stagecoach, was that the Hawthorne brothers had not placed their advertisement randomly. Their interest in her was not entirely what it seemed, and the secret that connected their family to hers was already burning a hole in the eldest brother's chest, pressed against his skin like a brand. Emiline waited at the station for nearly an hour. She watched Silver Creek go about its business through eyes that had become expert at reading the language of rejection. A woman carrying a basket of laundry glanced her way, and something shifted in her expression, a tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes before she looked away with deliberate speed. 2 men on the porch of the general store stopped their conversation as Emiline's gaze passed over them, then resumed it in lowered voices that carried the unmistakable cadence of gossip. A girl of perhaps 16, pretty in the unfinished way of frontier youth, stared openly for several seconds before her mother pulled her inside by the elbow, with a sharp word Emiline could not hear but could easily imagine. She knew the choreography of exclusion. She had learned it in Helena, where it had been performed with the polished cruelty of a society that prided itself on manners even while destroying someone's life. Here in Silver Creek, the steps were rougher, less rehearsed, but the dance was the same. Turn away, lower the voice, cross the street. Pretend the person standing right in front of you is invisible, because acknowledging their existence would require acknowledging your own capacity for cruelty and that is a mirror most people prefer not to face. Edith Pemberton, wife of the dry goods merchant, actually crossed the street to avoid walking past the station platform. The maneuver was so obvious, so theatrically elaborate, involving a sudden fascination with a shop window she had passed 1,000 times before, that it would have been funny if it had not felt like being stabbed with a very small, very precise knife. Just when Emiline was beginning to consider the horrifying possibility that no one was coming for her at all, that the letter was a cruel joke, or a clerical error, or a test she had already failed, she heard hoofbeats. Not one horse but three approaching from the mountain road at an unhurried pace that spoke of men accustomed to covering distance without wasting effort or energy or breath. The Hawthorne brothers arrived like a force of nature that had taken human form and decided for reasons of its own to wear boots and leather. Three men on horseback, each and one taller and broader than any man Emiline had ever seen in Philadelphia. Drawing rooms or Helena courthouse corridors, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, in a way that made them appear almost mythic. They rode with the easy confidence of men who had been born on horseback and had never found a reason to dismount permanently. Their horses were big, well-kept animals that moved with the disciplined coordination of creatures trained by patient, capable hands. They pulled to a stop before the station platform in a synchronized movement that suggested years of working together in wordless understanding, the kind of coordination that comes not from practice, but from shared blood and shared labor and the deep unspoken knowledge of family. Wyatt Hawthorne was the first to dismount. He swung down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man for whom physical movement was as natural as breathing, and approached Emiline with a warm smile that immediately changed the temperature of the air around her. He removed his tan cowboy hat, revealing dark blonde hair, matted with honest sweat, and extended a calloused hand the size of a dinner plate. He was tall, 6'5", at least lean and athletic, in the way of a man who used his body for work rather than display. His hazel eyes held gold flecks that caught the light like sparks, and his smile contained enough genuine warmth to heat a small room in January. "Miss Whitfield, I'm Wyatt Hawthorne. Welcome to Silver Creek." His voice carried a natural friendliness that seemed incapable of deception. "I hope the journey wasn't too rough. These mountain roads have a way of testing a person's commitment to arriving anywhere." Levi followed his brother, quieter in his approach, moving with the rangy grace of a man who spent more time in wilderness than in civilization. He was the same height as Wyatt, but built differently, leaner through the waist, broader through the shoulders, with the coiled energy of someone who was always ready to move fast in any direction. His auburn hair caught copper highlights in the fading sunlight, and his deep green eyes studied Emiline with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading tracks and terrain and the thousand small signs that the natural world uses to communicate its intentions. "Ma'am," he said simply, and removed his wide-brimmed hat. There was a gentleness in his deep voice that surprised her, a quietness that felt like shelter rather than emptiness. But it was the third brother who captured Emiline's attention entirely. Silas Hawthorne remained mounted for a moment longer than his brothers, watching her from the height of his saddle with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was enormous, not merely tall, but built on a scale that seemed to belong to a different century when men were forged by the land rather than shaped by comfort. 6'6", with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, and arms roped with muscle that spoke of years of labor that went far beyond ordinary ranch work. His chestnut brown hair was longer than his brother's, pushed back beneath a wide-brimmed brown hat, and his jaw carried the shadow of several days' growth that would have looked unkempt on a smaller man, but on him simply looked inevitable, as if even his beard was too stubborn to be tamed by convention. But it was the scars that told the real story. They mapped his hands and forearms like the routes on one of her father's survey maps, each one a record of violence survived. An old rope burn wound its way around his left forearm like a pale snake. A faded line across his right knuckle spoke of a fight that had been settled with fists rather than words. And there at the open collar of his leather vest, she caught a glimpse of something that made her pulse quicken despite herself. A faded bullet graze on his shoulder, the kind of wound that comes from being shot at close range and surviving. When he finally dismounted, the earth seemed to acknowledge his arrival. He approached Emiline with measured steps, each one deliberate and weighted with intention, and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. At 5'3", she barely reached his chest. His eyes were amber, Not brown, not gold, but amber, like whiskey held up to firelight, and they contained a controlled intensity that was simultaneously the most frightening and the most compelling thing Emiline had ever encountered. When he looked at her, she felt truly seen for the first time in 6 months. Not judged, not pitied, not dismissed. Seen. Miss Whitfield. His voice was deeper than his brother's, rougher, carrying the texture of someone who had spent years shouting orders over gunfire and wind and the protests of men and animals pushed to their limits. I'm Silas. We've been expecting you. Something in his tone told her that he knew. He knew who her father was. He knew the name she carried like a millstone around her neck. And he had come anyway, riding 3 miles down a mountain road with his brothers, flanking him like an honor guard to collect a woman the rest of the world had decided was not worth the effort of acknowledging. Thank you, she managed. Her voice was steadier than she had expected, and she was distantly proud of that small victory. I appreciate you meeting me. Silas's amber eyes held hers for a moment longer than was comfortable. Something moved behind them, quick and carefully controlled like a fish turning in deep water. Not judgment, not pity, something harder to name. Recognition, perhaps. Or the attention of a man who was looking for something specific and was not yet sure whether he had found it. Let's get you home, he said, and reached for her trunk with one hand lifting it as if it contained feathers, rather than the compressed remains of a life that had been dismantled piece by piece over 6 months. As he turned toward the horses, Emiline caught a full view of the scar tissue visible at his collar, the bullet graze she had glimpsed before. It was old, well healed, but the skin around it carried the smoothness that comes from a wound that nearly killed its owner. She found herself wondering what kind of life leaves marks like that. What kind of man advertises for a mail-order bride and comes to collect her carrying the evidence of 100 fights on his body? And beneath that question, another one quieter and more dangerous. What kind of man looks at a woman the world has discarded and sees something worth the 3-mile ride down the mountain? The Hawthorne Ranch sat 3 miles outside Silver Creek, nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges that the brothers simply called the East Ridge and the West Ridge. The ride there followed a road that wound through stands of pine and aspen, climbing gradually into country that felt increasingly remote with every turn. The air thinned and cooled, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine resin and snowmelt, and the deep silence of high places where human noise has not yet learned to stick. Emiline rode with Wyatt on the wagon bench, while Silas and Levi flanked them on horseback, creating an escort that was both casual and unmistakably deliberate. Wyatt filled the ride with easy conversation, pointing out landmarks with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved the land he lived on. That ridge there, that was where the elk gathered in autumn. The creek that crossed the road at the third bend, that was the best trout fishing in Montana if you knew where to cast. The old lightning-struck pine at the top of the rise, that was how you knew you were on Hawthorne land. The property was breathtaking. Hundreds of acres of grassland and forest spread out before them as they crested the final hill, and Emiline felt her chest constrict with something that took her several seconds to identify as beauty. The ranch house was a large timber frame structure with a wraparound porch that looked out over the valley like the bridge of a ship surveying its ocean. A massive barn stood behind it, solid and well-maintained, flanked by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of years of hard labor and careful expansion. Horses moved in the near pasture with the comfortable ease of animals that were well-fed and well-treated. The house itself surprised her. She had expected bachelor roughness, the familiar chaos that men create when left to their own devices. Dirty dishes and dirt floors, and the smell of things left too long unwashed. Instead, she found a home that was sparse but clean, with solid furniture made from local timber, a large stone fireplace that dominated the main room, and a kitchen that, while basic, contained everything needed to prepare proper meals. Our mother built most of this before she passed, Wyatt explained, reading her surprise with the perceptiveness that seemed to run in the Hawthorne blood. Pa helped, of course, but Ma was the one with the vision. Said a house should feel like arms wrapping around you when you walk through the door. When did she pass? Emiline asked softly. 8 years ago. It was Levi who answered, standing in the doorway with the setting sun behind him, turning his auburn hair to copper. His green eyes softened with a tenderness that transformed his quiet features. Influenza winter. Pa followed her within the year. Could not see the point of breathing without her, I think. The simple honesty of the statement hit Emiline with unexpected force. The image it created of a man so connected to his wife that her absence made his own existence feel purposeless resonated with something deep inside her that she had been trying not to examine too closely. She blinked hard against the sting in her eyes and turned toward the window before anyone could see what was happening on her face. They showed her to a room that was clearly prepared with care. A real room with a door that closed and a lock that worked, and a bed with a clean quilt pieced together in a pattern of blue and white that reminded her with a sharp pang of the quilts her mother used to make. A washstand stood against one wall with a pitcher of fresh water and a bar of soap that smelled of lavender. And on the windowsill, catching the last light of the day, someone had placed a small glass jar of wildflowers. Mountain asters and Indian paintbrush, their colors vivid against the rough wood of the sill. The gesture was so unexpectedly tender that Emiline had to sit on the bed and press her hands against her face until the threatening tears retreated. Someone in this house, one of these enormous, scarred, weathered mountain men, had gone out into the fields and picked flowers and arranged them in a jar and placed them in her room because they wanted her to feel welcome. The contrast between this simple kindness and the months of deliberate cruelty she had endured was almost too much to process. When she had composed herself enough to rejoin the brothers, she found supper waiting. Elk stew that Wyatt had prepared with surprising skill, thick with root vegetables and seasoned with herbs that spoke of someone who had paid attention when their mother cooked. Cornbread still warm from the oven. Coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, poured into tin mugs that had seen years of service. They sat around a rough-hewn table that could have seated 8, and the brothers explained the arrangement with a careful directness that Emiline found both refreshing and terrifying. "We need help running this place," Silas said from the head of the table, his large hands wrapped around his coffee mug, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the violence written across his knuckles. "3 men can work the land and the cattle, but a homestead needs more than muscle to function. It needs someone to manage the household, tend the garden, keep us from eating trail rations every night until we forget what real food tastes like. And eventually," Wyatt added with a smile that carried warmth without pressure, "one of us will court you proper. But there is no rush and no obligation. You get to choose if and when that happens. Until then, you are a guest in our home with a room of your own and our word that you will be treated with respect. We are not the kind of men who take advantage," Levi said quietly from behind his coffee mug. "Whatever you have heard about mountain folk." Emiline looked at each of them in turn. Wyatt's open warmth, the kind that made you want to trust him, even when your survival instincts were screaming caution. Levi's quiet sincerity, the feeling of a man who said little but meant every word that passed his lips. And Silas. Silas, whose amber eyes watched her with an intensity that made the air between them feel charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, when the hair on your arm stands up and you know something is coming, but cannot yet tell whether it will destroy you or simply change everything. "I should tell you something first," she said. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were trembling beneath the table where no one could see them clasped together so tightly that her knuckles ached. "My name is Emiline Whitfield. My father was Henry Whitfield." She paused, waiting for the recognition, the withdrawal, the sudden temperature drop that always followed the speaking of that name. "He was hanged 6 months ago for selling government maps to the Cartwright gang. If that changes things between us, I would rather know now than later." The silence that followed was a living thing. It filled the kitchen like water filling a bowl, rising slowly to the brim. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, a horse nickered softly in the gathering dark. Wyatt and Levi exchanged a glance that lasted perhaps 1 second, but carried an entire conversation within it. Emiline had seen that kind of look before between her parents when she was small, the wordless communication of people who know each other so well that language becomes optional. Silas's amber eyes never left her face. Not for a heartbeat, not for the duration of a breath. "We know who your father was," he said finally. His voice carried no judgment, no pity, no anger, nothing but the flat calm of a statement of fact delivered by a man who does not waste words on pretense. "We knew before we sent the letter." The words landed on Emiline like a physical blow, but in reverse. Instead of knocking her down, they held her up. She felt the ground shift beneath her, felt the careful architecture of her expectations rearrange itself around a truth she had not anticipated. "You knew, and you still invited me here." A woman should not have to answer for her father's sins, Wyatt said firmly. Whatever he did or did not do, that is, between him and the Almighty. Did not do, Emiline whispered before she could stop herself, and the two words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, dangerous and revealing and impossible to take back. Something sharpened in Silas's eyes, a flash quick and carefully controlled like a blade turning in lamplight. He had heard what she said. More than that, he had heard what she meant. And the look that crossed his face in that instant before the walls went back up was not surprise. It was confirmation, as if her words had just verified something he had already suspected. Only Wyatt responded gently but clearly. Then you are especially welcome here, Emiline. Everyone deserves a fair start. That night, lying in her new bed with the quilt pulled to her chin, and the mountain wind whispering against the window glass, and the scent of wildflowers drifting from the jar on the sill, Emiline Whitfield allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in 6 months. It was small and fragile, barely distinguishable from the fear it grew beside, like a single green shoot pushing up through scorched earth. But it was there, unmistakable, alive, hope. She did not know that in the room next to hers, separated by nothing more than a wall of pine planks and the weight of secrets, Silas Hawthorne sat at his desk in the darkness. The oil lamp was out. He did not need light for what he was doing because he had done it so many times that his fingers knew the movements by memory. From the false bottom of his saddlebag, he withdrew a letter. The paper was old, folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become soft as cloth. The handwriting was careful, precise. The penmanship of a man who made his living with maps and measurements and the exact placement of lines on paper. It was the handwriting of Henry Whitfield. The letter had been addressed to Jack Hawthorne, Silas's father. It had arrived at the ranch 3 months after Jack was already in the ground. Wyatt had received it, recognized the name on the envelope as someone their father had once called friend, and unwilling to open a dead man's mail, had forwarded it to Silas through the Federal Postal Service. It had found him in Wyoming, where he was working as a guide for a cattle drive, living the rootless existence of a man who had left the U.S. Marshals 2 years earlier and had not yet found a reason to stop moving. Silas had opened the letter in a bunkhouse that smelled of sweat and leather and the hollow loneliness of men who sleep in places that belong to no one. What he read had changed the direction of his life as completely and irreversibly as a river changing course after an earthquake. He read it again now in the darkness of a room 20 feet from where Henry Whitfield's daughter slept. Jack, if this letter reaches you, it means I am already gone. I have been condemned for a crime I did not commit, and no one will listen. The evidence against me was manufactured by someone with access to federal materials and knowledge that only a person inside the system could possess. The seal on the indictment that convicted me is wrong, Jack. The left wing of the eagle has 5 feathers instead of 6. I noticed it during the trial, tried to tell my attorney, but he dismissed it as the ravings of a desperate man. Perhaps he was right about the desperate part, but not about the ravings. That seal is a forgery, and only someone who has handled real federal documents every day of their working life would know the difference. I cannot prove who did this to me, but I know it was someone close to the court, someone trusted, someone whose word would never be questioned. Jack, you are the only person outside my family that I trust. If you are reading this, please, protect Clara. She goes by Emiline now, her middle name, trying to hide from what they did to me. She has no one in this world. She is innocent, and she is the smartest, bravest person I have ever known. Do not let them destroy her the way they destroyed me. Silas folded the letter along its familiar creases and pressed it against his chest. He had carried it there for months against his skin like a wound that would not heal, because healing would mean forgetting. He had come back to Silver Creek not because anyone ordered him to, not because the Pinkerton Agency or the U.S. Marshals or any official body had sent him. He had come back because his father had not lived long enough to keep a promise to a friend. And Silas Hawthorne, whatever else he might be, whatever scars he carried, and whatever sins he had committed during 8 years of violence and wandering, was a man who understood that some debts pass from father to son, like blood, like bone, like the shape of a arrow or the color of eyes. He had the skills. 4 years as a U.S. Marshal had taught him how to investigate, how to track evidence, how to distinguish the real from the manufactured. 2 years as a bounty hunter had taught him patience and the focused attention that allows a man to sit still for hours while watching a door and never lose focus. And the years before that, the years of watching his mother die and his father hollow out from the inside like a tree rotted by grief, those years had taught him something no badge or paycheck could provide. They had taught him that the worst thing a man can do is nothing. That silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality, it is complicity. So he had come home. He had convinced his brothers that they needed a woman to help run the ranch, which was true. He had suggested they place an advertisement, which was reasonable. And he had made sure through careful inquiry and a letter to a contact in Helena that the advertisement reached Emiline Whitfield, who was desperate enough to answer it, and brave enough to travel 1,000 miles to a place where her name was already known and already poisoned. He had planned to keep his distance, to investigate quietly to verify her innocence without becoming involved to find the real traitor and expose them with the cold efficiency of a man performing a professional duty. But then she had stepped off that stagecoach, and she had those eyes. Her father's eyes, blue as the Montana sky in October, carrying the same intelligence and the same stubborn refusal to look away from things that hurt. Silas pressed the letter harder against his chest and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. 2 weeks passed, and Emiline Whitfield settled into the rhythm of ranch life with the determination of someone who understood that survival required adaptation, and that adaptation required work, and that work, honest and physical and demanding, was the closest thing to medicine that a broken spirit could find. She rose before dawn each morning to prepare breakfast. She tended the kitchen garden that had gone wild in the absence of a woman's care, pulling weeds and turning soil, and coaxing vegetables from earth that had been neglected but not yet forgotten. She mended clothes that the brothers had been wearing until they fell apart, her needle moving through fabric with the precise attention her grandmother had drilled into her during years of patient instruction. She organized the household stores, bringing order to a pantry that had devolved into chaos, labeling jars and rotating supplies, and creating the invisible infrastructure that transforms a building where people sleep into a home where people live. The work was hard but honest, and Emiline found unexpected comfort in its simple demands. Flour and water became bread, seeds became vegetables, disorder became order. In a world that had stripped her of everything, the ability to create something useful with her own hands felt like the first small step back toward being human. Her relationship with each brother developed along lines as distinct as the men themselves. Wyatt became her primary companion during trips to town and daily ranch work. His easy charm created a protective buffer between Emiline and Silver Creek's judgment, deflecting hostility with humor and disarming suspicion, with a smile so genuine that even the most determined gossips found it difficult to maintain their cruelty in his presence. One afternoon, as they rode back from a supply run, Emiline asked him why he never spoke about himself, why his warmth always seemed directed outward toward others rather than inward toward his own needs. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. The only sound was hoofbeats and the creak of leather and the wind moving through pine needles overhead. "There was someone," he said finally, "a woman in the valley. She died of the typhoid 3 years back." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I have smiled more since she died than I ever did before. Not because I am happy, because if I ever stop smiling, I'm afraid I will never stop doing the other thing." The raw honesty of it created a bond between them that was not romance but something equally rare. The understanding between two people who both know what it feels like to lose someone and keep breathing anyway. Not because breathing is a choice, but because the body refuses to stop even when the heart has forgotten why it should. Levi became her teacher. He took her into the mountains and showed her the wild pharmacy that grew on every slope and in every meadow building on the foundation her grandmother had laid with years of careful instruction. He knew which bark reduced fever, and which root eased pain, and which leaves brewed into tea could calm a racing heart without dulling the mind that drove it. They spent quiet afternoons together among the wildflowers and the ancient stones, and in those silences, Emiline discovered something she had not expected. Levi Hawthorne was not simply quiet, he was listening, to the wind, to the birds, to the frequency at which truth vibrates when it is trying to make itself heard above the noise of human foolishness. "Tracking is not just about reading signs," Levi told her one afternoon as they sat on the flat stone of the place he called the Thinking Meadow, a high clearing above the ranch where ancient stone cairns marked what he believed was a gathering place used by native peoples long before settlers arrived. It is about reading what is not there. Sometimes the most important thing about a trail is what is missing from it. The words settled into Emiline's mind like seeds, and she felt something stir in the soil of her understanding that she was not yet ready to name. Silas remained an enigma. He was courteous, protective, unfailingly respectful, and completely unreadable. He watched her with those amber eyes, and she could never quite determine whether he was looking at her with personal interest or with the careful attention of a man cataloging evidence for a case he had not yet explained. His physical presence dominated every room he entered, not through aggression, but through sheer scale and the natural gravity that large men carry when they have learned to move with precision rather than force. When he spoke, which was seldom, his words landed with the weight of stones dropped into still water. One evening, she found him sitting alone on the porch in the darkness, staring at the stars with an expression of such profound loneliness that her heart physically ached. "You do not have to sit out here alone," she said quietly from the doorway. "Maybe I am used to it," he replied without turning around. "Being used to something does not mean you have to accept it forever." He turned then, and in the moonlight, his scarred face looked both ancient and young. A man caught between the person he had been and the person he might still become. "You sound like someone who knows." "I know loneliness," Emiline said simply. "I have been its guest for 6 months." Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the wall, a glimpse of the man behind the fortifications. "Sit with me then. If you are offering company, I will not turn it down." They sat together on the porch steps close enough that Emiline could feel the warmth radiating from his body like heat from a banked fire, and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead in the vast Montana sky. Neither spoke, and the silence between them held more truth than any words could carry. The Founders' Day celebration arrived with the inevitability of seasons turning. Silver Creek's annual gathering commemorating the town's founding 30 years prior was held in the community hall, a large timber structure in the center of town that served as church on Sundays, meeting house on Mondays, and dance hall whenever the occasion demanded. Attendance was expected of every resident, and absence would be noticed and discussed, with the relentless enthusiasm that small towns reserve for those who fail to participate in collective rituals. Emiline dressed with care in the deep green wool dress she had been saving. The last remnant of her former life, its color bringing out the vivid blue of her eyes in a way that made her reflection in the washstand mirror look for just a moment like the woman she had been before everything changed. She braided her honey blonde hair and pinned it with simple brass pins, knowing that anything more elaborate would draw the wrong kind of attention. The hall was already alive with lantern, light, and fiddle music, and the buzz of 200 people gathered in one space to celebrate, gossip, drink, and conduct the ancient business of being human in proximity to other humans. Tables groaned under potluck dishes. Children wove between adult legs. The air smelled of pine and roasted meat, and the compressed warmth that bodies generate when packed together in a wooden room with a fire at one end. Emiline felt the shift the moment she walked through the door. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Eyes found her, assessed her, dismissed her, all in the space of a single breath. She recognized the choreography. It was the same dance she had endured in Helena, reproduced here among strangers who had already heard the story and rendered their verdict without the inconvenience of meeting the defendant. Edith Pemberton's whisper carried from a nearby table with the precision of an arrow aimed at a known weakness. "Of all the nerve," showing her face here, "after what her father did to those poor families." "Blood tells," another woman's voice agreed, lower but no less lethal. "Treachery runs in that line like poison in a stream." Emiline chose her seat with the strategic precision of someone who had become an expert in the geography of exclusion. A table near the wall where the lantern light barely reached. Close enough to appear present, far enough to avoid confrontation. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her untouched plate of food growing cold, and watched the celebration unfold around her, like a party thrown in a language she no longer spoke. The brothers were pulled into separate conversations, drawn away by the social obligations that attend their status as one of Silver Creek's most prominent families. She watched them from her exile, Wyatt cornered by ranchers, Levi deep in conversation with old Ezekiel Bridger, Silas engaged by Mayor Harlan Prescott in a discussion that seemed designed to keep him occupied and away from her. She was preparing to leave, to slip out quietly, and walk 3 miles back to the ranch in the darkness, rather than endure another moment of this exquisite isolation when she became aware of something. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, purposeful, approaching her table with the rhythm of a man who has chosen a direction and will not deviate from it regardless of what stands in his path. Silas Hawthorne materialized out of the crowd like a mountain appearing through clouds. He had somehow extracted himself from the mayor's conversation and crossed the entire hall to reach her, his massive frame cutting through the packed room the way a ship's prow cuts through waves, other guests stepping aside without conscious thought because the alternative was being stepped on. He stopped beside her chair. His enormous body blocked the stairs from the nearest tables like a living wall of leather and muscle and controlled intensity. He leaned down. His rough voice was close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath against her ear, close enough to smell leather and pine resin and something clean and masculine and indefinably dangerous that she had come to associate with Silas Hawthorne alone. Act like you're with me. 4 words. 4 simple words that carried the weight of everything she had lost and everything she might still find. Not a request, not a suggestion, an offering. A hand extended to someone drowning by a man who knew exactly how deep the water was because he had been drowning in his own depths for years. People will talk, she whispered. People are already talking. Might as well give them something worth discussing. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every rational thought in her head screamed warnings about targets and consequences and the terrible mathematics of association where being seen with the wrong person multiplies your vulnerability rather than dividing it. But his amber eyes held hers with a conviction that left no room for doubt. And in those eyes she saw something she recognized with the shock of sudden understanding. She saw her own loneliness reflected back at her from a depth she had not known another person could reach. Against every rational thought, Emiline placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that made her breath catch. She felt the calluses, the rough warmth, the controlled strength of a hand that could bend horseshoes but chose to hold hers, as if she were made of something precious and irreplaceable. He drew her to her feet. Silas draped his leather jacket across her shoulders, the heavy leather still warm from his body, carrying the scent of pine and smoke, and the long Montana distances he had traveled to reach this moment. The weight of it settled over her like armor, like a declaration. Then he led her toward the dance floor. The hall went silent, not the gradual trailing off of scattered conversations, but a collective sharp-edged silence that descended like the moment between lightning and thunder. Every eye in the room fixed on them. Edith Pemberton's mouth fell open, mid-whisper. Mayor Prescott's drink froze halfway to his lips. Virgil Crandall, the loudest voice of condemnation against Emiline's family, actually set down his whiskey glass with a thump of pure disbelief. Silas Hawthorne, the eldest brother, the most powerful man in Silver Creek outside of elected office, was publicly claiming the traitor's daughter. The fiddle band, after a moment of confused hesitation, struck up a slow waltz, and then they were moving. Silas led Emiline through the steps with a grace that seemed impossible for a man his size, each movement controlled and precise and surprisingly tender, as if the violence mapped across his body had been converted through some mysterious alchemy into its exact opposite. "Breathe," he murmured as they turned. "You are doing fine. Everyone is staring. Let them." The faintest ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Some sights are worth staring at." For the duration of that dance, Emiline Whitfield forgot to be ashamed. She forgot the whispers. She forgot the stares. She forgot the crushing weight of a name that had become a curse. She felt only the steady strength of his hand at her waist, the controlled power of his movements, and the warmth of his amber eyes looking at her as if she were the only person in the room. When the song ended, Silas did not immediately release her. They stood there in the center of the floor, surrounded by whispers and wide eyes, and Emiline realized that something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the room, not just in the town's perception of her, but inside her own chest, where a door she had nailed shut 6 months ago had cracked open just enough to let the light in. "Thank you," she said quietly. "The evening is still young," he replied. His thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand, a gesture so subtle that no one else could have seen it, and so tender that it made her throat tighten with feelings she was not ready to examine. "And I suspect we have only just begun to give them something to talk about." As they returned to a table that was now unmistakably theirs, Emmeline caught sight of Mayor Prescott watching them with an expression she could not read. Not hostility, not approval. Something more complex. The look of a man performing rapid calculations about power and allegiance and the shifting geometry of a small-town social order. And beneath that calculation, if she looked closely enough, something that might have been the first uncomfortable stirring of a conscience that had been sleeping for a very long time. Outside the hall, the Montana night pressed against the windows, dark and cold and full of stars. And somewhere in that darkness, growing closer with each passing day, a reckoning was approaching that would test every bond that was forming in this room. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight, Emmeline Whitfield sat beside a man who had looked at her as if she mattered, wearing his jacket across her shoulders like a shield against the world, and allowed herself to believe for the first time in 6 months that maybe the story of her life was not a tragedy after all. Maybe it was just the first chapter of something she had not yet learned to imagine. Dawn crept over Silver Creek like a cautious animal, pale light filtering through the mountain mist that clung to the valley the way secrets cling to small towns persistently and with no intention of letting go. The air held the stillness of early autumn when summer has exhausted itself, but winter has not yet gathered the courage to arrive. Frost silvered the grass outside Emmeline's window, turning the ranch yard into something that looked for a few fragile minutes like a landscape made of glass. Emmeline woke with the memory of the previous evening, wrapped around her like Silas's leather jacket, which still lay across the chair where she had placed it before sleep. The leather held his scent, pine resin and wood smoke, and the steady warmth that radiated from his body like heat from a forge. She had expected to wake with regret, to find that daylight had burned away the magic of the founder's day dance, the way morning burns away fog, leaving nothing but the cold, bare reality of ground that looked better when it was hidden. Instead, she felt something she had not experienced since her father's arrest. Anticipation. The sensation made her nervous. She had learned through 6 months of brutal instruction that hope was the cruelest emotion in the human inventory. Not because it was false, but because it was fragile. Because it made the distance between where you stood and where you fell so much greater that the impact when it came could break things that pain alone could never touch. She dressed carefully in a calico work dress and braided her hair in a practical style. A knock at the front door startled her before she could reach the kitchen. She opened it to find Silas filling the doorframe, his chestnut hair neatly pushed back, his jaw freshly shaved for what appeared to be the first time since she had arrived. In his hands he held nothing, but his eyes went to the leather jacket draped over the chair behind her, and something shifted in his expression. Not embarrassment, something closer to hope wearing the disguise of practicality. "I believe you have something of mine," he said. "You did not need to come for it personally." She retrieved the jacket and held it out, and when their fingers brushed during the exchange, neither of them pulled away as quickly as the moment required. "Perhaps not, but I wanted to ask if you would ride into town with us this morning. Supply run needs doing, and I have been told my judgment in flour quality is not to be trusted." Emmeline studied him. This man who had crossed a crowded hall to claim her in front of 200 people was now standing on her porch, inventing reasons to spend the morning in her company. The jacket he took back still carried the faint scent of her lavender soap, and she watched him notice it. Watched him choose not to mention it, watched the corner of his mouth tighten against a smile he was not ready to release. "I suppose someone has to keep you from buying the wrong kind of salt," she said. "That is exactly what I was afraid of." When she entered the kitchen, she found Wyatt and Levi already seated at the table with coffee, and the atmosphere in the room held a quality Emmeline could not immediately identify. Something planned, something deliberate, something that had been discussed before she arrived and agreed upon without her knowledge. Wyatt pushed a plate of biscuits toward her empty chair. "Morning, Emmy. Sleep well." The casual use of the shortened name startled her. No one had called her Emmy since her father. The word cracked open something in her chest that she immediately tried to close. "Better than I have in months, actually." "Good." Wyatt glanced at his brothers and received imperceptible nods. "All 4 of us going to town today. Together." The implication needed no translation. After last night's public declaration, they intended to reinforce the message. This was not a retreat or a moment of weakness or a decision they had made in the heat of celebration and were now reconsidering in the sober light of morning. This was strategy. The Hawthorne brothers were doubling down on their claim, and they were doing it in daylight, where there was no ambiguity and no cover of lantern light to soften the meaning. People will stare, Emiline warned, but something in her voice had changed since last night. A note that sounded, if you listened carefully, almost like defiance. Let them, Levi said from behind his coffee mug, and the quiet declaration carried the weight of absolute conviction from a man who had never in his life said anything he did not mean completely. The ride into Silver Creek took 40 minutes along the mountain road that wound through stands of pine and aspen, the autumn air carrying the sharp, clean scent of approaching winter. Emiline rode with Wyatt on the wagon bench while Silas and Levi flanked them on horseback, creating an escort that was both casual and unmistakably intentional. Anyone watching from the road or from the windows of outlying homesteads would see exactly what the Hawthorne brothers wanted them to see: a family, traveling together. With Emiline Whitfield sitting prominently among them, chin raised, spine straight, wearing a position that had been publicly offered and publicly accepted. The first few residents they encountered in town reacted with surprise but not hostility. Old Ezekiel Bridgert is sitting on the porch of the general store whittling a piece of cedar with hands that had been carving wood since before Montana was a territory raised one gnarled fist in greeting without comment. His eyes, sharp as glass splinters, despite his years, tracked them with the knowing attention of a man who had watched this town's dramas unfold for half a century and had learned that the most interesting stories always started with someone doing something everyone else was afraid to do. A farmer's wife whose name Emiline could not recall nodded politely as they passed. It was a small gesture, barely more than a dip of the chin, but in the currency of small-town social dynamics, it represented a significant transaction. Acknowledgement, not friendship, not approval, but the recognition that Emiline Whitfield existed and was at minimum a person worth nodding to. As they moved deeper into the settlement, the ripple effect intensified. Conversations paused. Women looked up from their washing and their sweeping and their eternal battle against the dust that seemed to regenerate on every surface overnight. Men stopped their work to watch the Hawthorne wagon pass with the trader's daughter, riding beside the most charming man in Silver Creek, flanked by the most dangerous and the most perceptive. They stopped at the general store where Emily needed flour salt and lamp oil. Wyatt accompanied her inside while Silas remained on the porch, leaning against a post, with his arms crossed over his chest, his massive frame and unreadable expression creating a silent statement that required no words to interpret. Inside the store, Mrs. Calloway, the proprietor's wife, looked up from her ledger and said something that would have been meaningless in normal circumstances, but that carried enormous weight in the economy of this moment. "Emiline, dear, what can I get for you today?" The casual use of her first name, the inclusion of dear. Small words, ordinary words, words that cost nothing to say and everything to withhold. Edith Pemberton's opinion was loud, but the Hawthorne brothers' endorsement was louder. The scales of Silver Creek's judgment were beginning slowly and reluctantly to tip. The transformative moment came at the herbalist corner of the trading post, a dusty table near the back where old Mrs. Thatcher sold dried herbs and remedies to those who could not afford Doc Harrigan's increasingly unreliable ministrations or who, for reasons of their own, preferred the old ways of healing to the new. Emiline paused at the display with the instinctive attention of someone whose hands and eyes had been trained since childhood to read the language of plants. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, clear as a bell struck in a quiet room. "Look before you touch, Emmy. The plant will tell you what it is if you know how to listen." What Emiline saw on Mrs. Thatcher's table sent a spike of alarm through her body. The St. John's wort had been dried too long, its yellow flowers faded to the color of old parchment, the medicinal oils evaporated beyond usefulness. The willow bark was mixed with an inferior species that looked similar, but contained none of the pain-relieving properties that made genuine white willow valuable. And the feverfew, the small white flowers that her grandmother had used 100 times to treat headaches and inflammation, was contaminated with ragwort. Ragwort that looked so similar to feverfew that even experienced herbalists could confuse them. Ragwort that brewed into tea and given to a child could damage the liver beyond repair. "Excuse me," Emiline said, and the words came out of her before conscious thought could stop them, carried by an urgency that overrode the caution she had been living inside for 6 months. "This feverfew is not safe. There is ragwort mixed in." They look alike, but ragwort is toxic. If someone brewed this for a child's headache, the consequences could be severe. Mrs. Thatcher's eyes went wide. She had been selling herbs for 20 years and had never noticed the contamination. Within minutes, Emiline was sorting through the entire stock, her hands moving with the practiced confidence of deep knowledge, separating safe preparations from dangerous ones, identifying substitutions and alternatives. Her grandmother's training flowing through her fingers and her voice with the fluency of a language learned before conscious memory. A crowd gathered around the table. Among them was a young woman named Nettie Dawson, holding a fussy toddler whose red feverish face and swollen gums spoke of teething pain that had been going on long enough to exhaust both mother and child. "Please," Nettie said, and her voice carried the ragged edge of desperation that every parent recognizes, the sound of someone who has been awake for 3 nights watching their child suffer and would do anything except help from anyone if it meant the crying would stop. Doc Harrigan said there is nothing to do but wait it out. But she will not stop crying, and I can bear to watch her hurt anymore. Emiline hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat, one single contraction of the muscle in her chest that measured the distance between who she had been and who she was afraid to become again. Then she reached into Mrs. Thatcher's remaining stock, selected chamomile for calming, clove for numbing, and a small amount of clean willow bark for fever, and began mixing a preparation she had made 100 times in her grandmother's kitchen. Steep this in warm water for 10 minutes. Not boiling, just warm. Let it cool until it is comfortable against the inside of your wrist. Then soak a clean cloth and let her chew on it. The chamomile will calm her, the clove will numb the gum pain, and the willow bark will help with the fever. Nettie took the small packet of herbs as if it were made of gold. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing, it is just herbs." "It is knowledge," Levi said quietly from behind Emiline, and she turned to find him watching the entire exchange with an expression she had not seen before. Not assessment, not curiosity, recognition. As if he had been waiting for this moment since the day she arrived, had known it was coming, the way he knew a storm was coming by the change in the wind, and was satisfied now that it had finally appeared. They stopped last at the silversmith's bench near the town square, where a craftsman named Horace Mercer displayed his work on tables covered with dark cloth. Silas examined several pieces with the unhurried attention of a man accustomed to evaluating quality, but it was a simple carved bone comb that caught his eye. The bone had been polished to a soft gleam, its spine carved with delicate knotwork patterns that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship. "My daughter made that one," Mercer said with obvious pride. 14 years old and already better with her hands than I will ever be. Silas turned to Emiline with the comb resting in his calloused palm. "Your hair deserves something better than brass pins." Before she could protest, he was counting silver coins onto the table. The silversmith's eyes moved between them with barely concealed interest. Here was the information that would circulate through Silver Creek before the sun reached its peak. "You should not have," Emiline said quietly as he placed the comb in her hands. The bone was warm from his touch, and she found herself tracing the carved patterns with her fingertip. "Probably not," Silas agreed. "Did it anyway." The simple gift felt precious beyond its modest value. When had anyone last given her something beautiful simply because they wanted to? She closed her fingers around the comb and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still tight. As they left the trading post, Silas walked beside her for the first time rather than behind or ahead. The slight change in position, invisible to anyone who was not paying attention, shifted something in the atmosphere between them. They were no longer protector and protected. They were walking together. "That was impressive," he said, and his deep voice carried a note she had not heard before. Admiration stripped of pretense and offered as simply as he offered at everything else. Directly, without decoration. "My grandmother taught me. She said knowledge was the one treasure that could never be stolen, even when everything else was taken." Smart woman. She was. She also said that true strength shows itself not in how hard a man can hit, but in how gently he can hold what matters to him. The words fell between them like a stone dropped into deep water, and the ripples spread outward through a silence that neither of them tried to fill. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His amber eyes held something that flickered and was quickly controlled, a flash of vulnerability in a man who had built his entire existence around never showing any. For one instant, Emiline glimpsed the person behind the scars, and what she saw there made her heart beat faster for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. 3 days later, Levi led Emiline back to the thinking meadow. The ancient stone cairns stood in their circle on the high ground above the ranch, patient witnesses to centuries of weather and human struggle. From this height, the entire valley spread below them like a painting. Silver Creek, a toy town of miniature buildings. The river, a silver thread stitching the land together. The Hawthorne Ranch, a brown dot against green pastures that were already beginning to fade to gold as autumn tightened its grip. They sat together on the flat stone, sharing bread and cheese that Emiline had packed, and the mountain air carried the scent of pine and dying leaves and the quality of silence that exists only in high places where the noise of human ambition cannot reach. "Tell me about your father," Levi said. The directness of the question no longer surprised her. She had learned that Levi Hawthorne communicated the way he tracked. Straight to the point without unnecessary detours, trusting the person he was speaking to the way he trusted the ground to tell him what had walked across it. And so Emiline told him. Not about the traitor described in court documents and newspaper headlines, but about the man she had known. A surveyor who loved maps the way other men loved horses or whiskey or women, not for what they were worth, but for what they represented. The possibility of knowing where you stood. The comfort of having the world laid out in lines and measurements and distances that could be calculated and trusted and relied upon. She told him about a father who taught his daughter to read at 4 because he believed that literacy was the most dangerous weapon a woman could carry and the most essential one. A father who had encouraged her grandmother's healing lessons because he understood that the ability to ease suffering was a form of power that no government could grant or revoke. A father who had told her every night before bed that she was the best thing he had ever helped create, and who had said it not as flattery, but as a statement of observed fact, the way he might note the coordinates of a mountain peak or the depth of a river crossing. He was many things, Emiline said, and her voice carried the careful honesty of someone who had spent 6 months examining every memory for contamination and had found them clean. Proud, sometimes too ambitious for his own good. He wanted his work to matter, wanted to leave something behind besides a grave marker. But a traitor, a man who would sell information, knowing it would get families killed, knowing that children would die because of what he did. She shook her head, and the motion carried a certainty that went deeper than opinion. It never felt right, Levi. The evidence was there, every piece of it, but it felt arranged, like someone had built a case the way you build a fence, each post in exactly the right position. Too perfect, too complete, too clean. Levi was quiet for a long time, watching a red-tailed hawk trace slow circles above the valley on currents of air that were invisible from the ground, but that the bird read as easily as a man reads words on a page. "When a deer walks through snow," he said finally, "it leaves a certain kind of track, irregular, hesitant, pausing to listen, changing direction when the wind shifts. A real trail tells a messy story, but when someone drags a dead deer through snow to make it look like it walked there on its own, the tracks are too clean, too even. No hesitation marks, no pauses, no places where the animal stopped to smell the air. A fake trail reads like a book, everything in order, nothing out of place." The metaphor struck Emiline with physical force. "That is exactly what the evidence was like," she whispered. "Trust that feeling," Levi said quietly. "The truest things usually come with rough edges." That evening, Emiline found Silas on the porch, their porch. She had begun to think of it that way, the space where his careful walls lowered enough for genuine conversation. The night was cold enough to see their breast stars sharp as broken glass overhead, and the darkness beyond the railing held the kind of silence that is not empty, but full packed with things that can only be heard when everything else stops making noise. She sat beside him, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, and for a while neither of them spoke. The fire inside the house popped and settled. Somewhere in the near pasture, a horse shifted its weight and blew softly into the cold air. "Levi took me to the thinking meadow," she said. "He does not take many people up there." Something moved in Silas's voice, a current beneath the surface. "Must mean he trusts you." "I think he was trying to tell me something about my father's case, about evidence that is too clean to be real." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable kind they had shared before. This one had weight, pressure. The quality of air inside a sealed room where someone has just lit a match near something flammable. Emiline. Silas's voice changed, not louder but deeper, as if it were coming from a place inside him that he did not often visit. There is something I need to tell you, but I need you to listen completely before you respond. She turned to face him, and in the starlight, his scarred features held an expression she had never seen on him before. Not control, not assessment, struggle. The look of a man fighting against his own nature, trying to force words through a throat that had spent years learning to swallow them. When I left Silver Creek 8 years ago, I did not leave because I wanted to see the world or make my fortune. I left because my mother had just died and I could not stand to watch my father disappear into his grief. I joined the United States Marshal Service, served 4 years, learned how to investigate crimes, track fugitives, build cases, read evidence, learned the difference between what is real and what has been manufactured to look real. He paused, and Emiline could feel the effort it cost him to continue the way you feel a horse gathering itself before a difficult jump. After I left the marshals, I drifted. Bounty hunting, guiding cattle drives, work that kept me moving because standing still meant thinking about the things I had run away from. The fact that I was not there when my father died. That Wyatt and Levi buried him without me. His voice roughened, and she heard in it the texture of a wound that time has scarred over but never fully healed. I was in Wyoming when a letter found me, forwarded from here by Wyatt. It was addressed to my father from a man my father had called his friend. The night seemed to hold its breath. The letter was from your father, Emiline, written from his cell before the execution. The world stopped moving. The stars froze in their positions. The wind died. Even the horse in his pasture went silent, as if the entire valley understood that something irreversible was about to be spoken. He wrote to my father because Jack Hawthorne was the only person outside his family that Henry Whitfield trusted. The letter said he had been framed, that the evidence was manufactured, that the seal on the indictment, the federal seal that should have carried 6 feathers on the left wing of the eagle, only carried 5. He noticed it during the trial and tried to tell his attorney, but no one listened. Emiline's hands began to shake. Not her fingers, not her wrists. Her hands from the bone outward, trembling with a violence that no amount of willpower could suppress. Your father asked mine to protect you, to keep you safe. My father was already dead when the letter arrived. He never read it. Silas reached inside his shirt and withdrew a piece of paper so worn from handling that it looked more like cloth than parchment. He held it out to her. So I am keeping the promise instead. Emiline took the letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately because she had grown up watching that hand draw maps and write reports and sign documents with the precise, careful penmanship of a man who believed that accuracy was a form of respect. She read her father's words in the starlight, and each sentence landed on her like a blow, delivered by someone she loved, painful and tender, and impossible to defend against. When she reached the final line, the one that said, "She has no one in this world, and she is the smartest, bravest person I have ever known," she had to put the letter down, because her vision had blurred beyond the ability to read, and her throat had closed around a sound that was not quite a and not quite a scream, but something in between that belonged to no language she knew. But then the implications hit her, and when they did, the tears stopped. You knew. Her voice went flat, not calm, not controlled. The flatness of a blade being drawn from a sheath. You knew from the beginning. Before you met me, before you invited me here, before you asked me to dance, before you held my hand in front of the whole town. Silas did not flinch, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw the muscles in his forearms cord beneath the skin, saw the cost of what was happening register on his body even though his voice remained steady. Yes, I was a mission. The word tasted like poison, a promise to keep, a debt to pay. That is what I am to you. That is what the dance was. That is what the jacket was. That is what every evening on this porch has been, you performing the duties of a dead man's obligation. No. Then what am I, Silas? She stood and the blanket fell from her shoulders, and she did not notice because the cold outside her body was nothing compared to the cold expanding inside her chest. Because right now, I cannot tell the difference between the truth and a lie, and I have had enough lies to last me the rest of my life. My father's trial was built on lies. My entire existence in this town is built on a lie. And now I find out that the one person I allowed myself to trust, was keeping the biggest secret of all. Emiline, listen to me. I have been listening. That is the problem. I listened to the court when they said my father was guilty. I listened to the people of Helena when they said I was worthless. I listened to you when you said, act like you are with me. And every single time I listened, what I heard turned out to be something other than what it sounded like. Silas stood. The chair behind him scraped against the porch boards with a sound like tearing cloth. He was a foot taller than her and 100 pounds heavier, and in this moment, none of that mattered because the look on Emiline's face could have cut through mountains. You want to know what is real? His voice dropped to a register she had never heard, rough and raw and stripped of every defense he had ever constructed. The letter is why I came back. That is true. The promise to your father is why I brought you here. That is true. But neither of those things is why I sat on this porch every night for 2 weeks waiting for you to come outside. Neither of those things is why I could not sleep after the dance. Neither of those things is why I crossed that hall and asked you to stand beside me. Because when I said those words, Emiline, when I said act like you are with me, I was not performing a duty. I was telling you the truth before I had the courage to know it was the truth. The rawness in his voice stopped her. She had spent 6 months learning to identify deception, to hear the false notes in voices that claimed kindness but delivered cruelty. She had become an expert in the frequency at which lies vibrate, that slight dissonance that most people ignore, but that she, after her father's trial, could hear the way a musician hears an out-of-tune instrument in an orchestra of 100. She listened now. She listened with everything she had, and she heard no dissonance, no false notes, nothing but the rough, unpolished sound of a man who had spent 8 years building walls and had just torn them down with his bare hands. Never hide anything from me again, she said, and the words were not a request. They were a condition, non-negotiable, the terms under which she would allow another human being back inside the perimeter she had drawn around herself. Never, he said, and the single word fell between them like a stone dropped into deep water, creating ripples that would reach shores neither of them could yet see. The news arrived 5 days later, carried by a dust-covered rider whose horse was blowing foam and whose face wore the expression of a man delivering information he wished he did not possess. 3 settlements along the northern supply route had been raided by the Cartwright gang. Homesteads burned to the ground, livestock driven off, 2 families taken hostage, their fate unknown. The attacks showed the same terrible precision that had characterized every raid linked to Henry Whitfield's supposed espionage. The raiders struck with exact knowledge of when each settlement would be most vulnerable, which buildings contained the most valuable supplies, where the nearest army patrol would be at the time of the attack, and how long it would take them to respond. The information that guided those raids could only have come from someone with access to current federal survey data, military patrol schedules, and settlement infrastructure reports. The same kind of information Henry Whitfield had been convicted of selling. The same kind of information that a dead man could not possibly be providing. Silver Creek erupted in fear and speculation, and the conclusion that emerged from the tangle of rumor and prejudice was both predictable and devastating. Henry Whitfield's spy network must still be active. Someone was continuing his work, and the most obvious suspect was the woman who had arrived in Silver Creek 6 weeks ago, carrying his name and his blood and his blue eyes that saw too much and revealed too little. Emiline heard the whispers from her garden, where she was harvesting the last late-season herbs before frost could claim them. Voices drifted from the road and from the cluster of women gathered at the town well, repeating the same poisonous arithmetic that had condemned her father. The raid started again right after she showed up. Coincidence. 3 Hawthorne brothers, and she has them all wrapped around her finger. Makes you wonder what she is sharing with them, or who else she is sharing it with. It was Levi who brought the first piece of evidence that would eventually tear the conspiracy apart. Not through investigation or interrogation or any of the formal methods that Silas had learned in his years as a marshal. Through tracking, through the quiet art of reading the story that the ground tells to anyone patient enough to listen. While checking the ranch's perimeter, a task he performed daily with the thoroughness of a man who trusted no fence and no boundary, that he had not personally verified, Levi discovered fresh horse tracks on the mountain trail that led north toward the territory where the raids had occurred. The tracks were unusual. The horses had been shod with a distinctive double-clip pattern that Levi had seen only once before in the livery stable attached to the federal courthouse in Helena. It was a pattern used exclusively by the personal farrier of Judge Cornelius Drake. Someone from the courthouse rode through our north pasture 2 days before the raids. Levi told his brothers that evening, spreading a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table with the careful precision he applied to everything. They came down from the Helena Road, crossed our land, and continued north toward the settlement route. The tracks were deliberately obscured. Brush dragged across the trail. Horses walked through water to break the scent, but they missed a section. He pointed to a mark on his map. Soft mud by the creek. Perfect impressions. Double clip pattern. Those are Drake's horses. Could be anyone from the courthouse, Wyatt said, but his voice carried the tone of a man presenting an objection he did not believe in because thoroughness required it. Those horses wear a pattern I have seen nowhere else in the territory, Levi replied. Drake's farrier uses a design he learned in Virginia. It is as distinctive as a signature. Silas turned to Emiline, and the look in his amber eyes was no longer the guarded assessment of their first meeting or the raw vulnerability of the night he revealed the letter. It was something colder, more focused, the look of a former U.S. Marshal whose investigation had just found its target. Your father's trial. Who presided? Judge Drake. The name came out of her mouth tasting like ash. Who personally led the search of your father's office? Who claimed to find the hidden gold? Drake. He insisted on conducting the search himself, said it was too sensitive for local deputies. And who brought in the witnesses who vouched for their credibility? Drake. He said they were reliable informants he had used in previous cases. Each answer fell like a hammer blow on an anvil, forging the scattered pieces of suspicion into a shape that could no longer be denied. Emiline felt understanding rise through her body like floodwater, cold and terrifying and impossible to stop. Oh God, she whispered. It was him. It was Drake all along. That night, when the house was dark and the brothers had retreated to their rooms, Emiline could not sleep. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, the words he had spoken at his trial that everyone had dismissed as the ravings of a desperate man. The evidence is arranged. Someone built this case like a fence, each post in exactly the right place. He had been telling the truth. He had been telling the truth, and nobody listened, and now he was dead. And the man who killed him was still alive and still wearing his judge's robes and still signing documents with a seal that bore 6 feathers on the left wing of the eagle, while the forgeries he created only bore 5. She lit a candle and retrieved the one document she had kept from her father's effects, the federal indictment that listed his crimes. She had read it dozens of times, torturing herself with its weight. But tonight, driven by Levi's words about trails that were too clean, and by the terrible clarity that comes when scattered facts finally arrange themselves into a coherent picture, she examined it with new eyes. And she saw what her grief-blinded eyes had missed. The eagle's left wing. She counted the feathers by candlelight, her finger trembling as it traced each tiny engraved line in the wax seal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 feathers, not 6. Her father had been right. He had been right, and he had tried to tell them, and they had hanged him anyway. She held the document closer to the candle and examined the paper itself. The weight was correct. The color was convincing. But the watermark, the faint pattern impressed into the paper that was visible only when held against light, showed branches of olive instead of laurel. A substitution so subtle that it would escape anyone who had not spent years watching their father verify government documents at his desk in the evenings, holding each page up to the lamplight, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who trusted precision the way other men trusted prayer. Emiline wrapped the document in oilcloth with hands that shook with something that was not fear but fury. The cold, clarifying fury of a woman who has just discovered that the system that killed her father was not broken. It was working exactly as designed by the man who had designed it to serve himself. She ran barefoot through the cold mountain air to the main house and hammered on Silas's door with a fist that knew exactly what it wanted. He opened it immediately as if he had been waiting, as if he had known the way Levi knew storms were coming by the change in the wind that this moment was approaching and could not be delayed. The indictment, she said, and her voice was clear and fierce and carried not a single tremor. The document that convicted my father. The seal is wrong. 5 feathers instead of 6. The watermark is wrong. Olive branches instead of laurel. It is a forgery, Silas. My father was telling the truth. He was telling the truth, and they killed him anyway. Within 10 minutes, all 4 of them were gathered around the kitchen table in candlelight. The forged indictment lay in the center of the table like a declaration of war, its false seal and lying words exposed to the light for the first time. 5 feathers, Silas said, his voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of barely suppressed fury. In olive branches instead of laurel. These are exactly the mistakes someone would make if they were working from memory rather than from an original. Someone who had access to government paper and knowledge of official formats, but who did not have the actual federal seal in front of them when they created this. Drake, Levi said. It was not a question. Drake, Silas confirmed. He has been the Cartwright gang's inside man for years, probably over a decade. When suspicion started circling, he needed a scapegoat. Someone with enough access to government information to be plausible. Someone whose conviction would satisfy investigators and close the case. My father, Emiline whispered. Your father was perfect for his purposes. Respected enough that his fall would be dramatic. Isolated enough a widower with no powerful allies that no one would dig deeply into the evidence. Silas's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out like cables beneath his skin. Drake manufactured every piece of it. The documents, the witnesses, the hidden gold. He executed an innocent man to protect his own treason. The confrontation with Virgil Crandall came 2 days later on a morning when the frost was thick enough to crunch underfoot and the air tasted of iron and approaching winter. Emiline and Wyatt were in town purchasing the heavy supplies needed to prepare the ranch for the months ahead. Flour in 50-pound sacks, salt for preserving meat, lamp oil by the gallon. The ordinary necessities of frontier survival bomb that took on an urgent weight when measured against the knowledge that Silver Creek would be cut off from the outside world once the mountain passes filled with snow. Virgil Crandall intercepted them outside the general store. He was a large man, thick with the remnants of cavalry muscle that had gone soft around the middle, his face permanently reddened by weather and whiskey, and the relentless heat of a self-righteous anger that never quite cools because it feeds on itself. He planted himself in the middle of the wooden sidewalk like a boulder in a stream. Well, now, if it is not the Hawthornes' little His voice was loud enough to ensure that every person on the street could hear, pitched at the frequency of a man performing for an audience rather than communicating with an individual. Taking your trader's whelp shopping Wyatt, or is she shopping for information to sell to the Cartwrights? Wyatt's easy smile remained in place, but Emiline had learned to read the Hawthorne brothers, and she saw the shift. The subtle redistribution of weight, the loosening of his shoulders, the way his right hand drifted casually toward his belt. Virgil, you have been drinking, and it is barely noon. Might want to save the speeches for when you can maintain a straight line. Do not you talk down to me, boy. Virgil's face darkened to a shade that suggested medical consequences if his blood pressure climbed any higher. Some of us remember what loyalty means. Some of us remember the families who died because of the information her daddy sold. She is not responsible for what her father was accused of. Accused, he was convicted, 17 dead, and you Hawthornes are parading her around like she is something to be proud of. The insult hung in the morning air. Emiline felt her face drain of color, felt the familiar cold spread through her body that came whenever the world reminded her that she would never be allowed to simply be a person. She would always be Henry Whitfield's daughter first and herself second, and in many people's eyes, not even that. But she had changed since the night she found the forged seal. The fury that had ignited inside her when she counted those 5 feathers, the cold, clean rage of a woman who had discovered that her father's death was not justice but murder had burned away something that fear had built and replaced it with something harder, something that did not flinch. My father denied every charge until the day he died, she said, and her voice carried across the street with a clarity that made several people stop walking. And the raids have continued since his death. If he was the informant who is feeding the gang their information now, the logical question landed on Virgil like a physical blow. His face contorted with the frustrated anger of a man confronting a truth his pride will not allow him to process. Do not try to confuse the issue with your fancy talk. The lady asked you a reasonable question. The voice came from behind Virgil, deep as a mine shaft and about as warm. Silas Hawthorne stepped around the corner of the general store carrying a 50-pound sack of grain on each shoulder as if they were pillows. He set them down slowly, deliberately, with the controlled impact that made the sidewalk boards vibrate under Virgil's boots. "When a man insults a woman under my family's protection on a public street," Silas said, his voice dropping to the register that made nearby dogs flatten their ears, "it becomes my concern, quickly." "This is not finished, Hawthorne." Virgil stepped back, his courage finally reaching the limits of what whiskey could sustain against the reality of Silas Hawthorne's physical presence. "When Judge Drake arrives, we will see who has been keeping the wrong company." "Yes," Silas replied, and something in his tone made Emiline look at him sharply. A certainty, a readiness. "We certainly will." It was at this moment that Mayor Harlan Prescott appeared from inside the general store, where he had clearly been listening through the open door. His timing was too precise to be accidental. He stepped onto the sidewalk with the measured stride of a politician who understood that how he handled the next 30 seconds would ripple through the community for months. "Virgil," Prescott's voice carried the official weight of elected authority, "I believe you have made your point. Perhaps it is time to make it somewhere else." The public rebuke, mild as it was, hit Virgil harder than any of Silas's implied threats. The mayor was not defending Emiline, but he was not taking a side. He was merely establishing that the disruption of public order on his main street was not something he intended to tolerate. But in the language of small-town politics, even that neutral intervention carried meaning. The mayor had not condemned Emiline, had not endorsed Virgil's accusations, had by his very presence and his very mildness suggested that the matter was not as settled as Virgil believed. Virgil departed with the stiff-legged of a man retreating from a position he is not ready to surrender, but no longer has the forces to defend. Drake arrived 2 days early. He came with 4 armed deputies and a federal warrant for Emiline Whitfield's arrest on charges of continuing her father's espionage activities. He came at dawn, the coldest hour, when the ranch was quiet and the brothers were scattered across the property, performing the morning tasks that could not wait, feeding livestock, checking fence lines, running trap lines in the high country. Emiline was alone. The sound of hoofbeats on frozen ground woke her from a sleep that had been shallow and troubled. She had barely risen from bed, her feet cold against the wooden floor, when she heard boots on the porch and the unmistakable hammering of authority against her front door. Open in the name of the Federal Court of Montana Territory. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. She spent 2 of those seconds standing perfectly still, feeling the terror wash through her body and waiting for it to recede. It did not recede. It stayed, filling every nerve and every thought, and she made her decision not despite the fear, but through it, the way a person walks through a fire, because the only alternative is standing still and burning. She pressed the oilcloth-wrapped indictment flat against her ribs beneath her nightgown, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door. Judge Cornelius Drake stood on the threshold. He was exactly as she remembered from her father's trial. Silver hair immaculate, black suit pressed and pristine despite the mountain journey, gold watch chain gleaming, wire-rimmed spectacles sitting precisely on the bridge of a nose that had never been broken because the man behind it had always been careful enough to let other people absorb the violence he orchestrated. His eyes were gray and cold, the color of winter sky reflected in still water, and they studied Emiline with the detached interest of a collector examining a specimen he intends to pin. "Miss Whitfield, you are hereby placed under arrest for suspicion of treason against the United States. You will accompany my deputies for questioning. I have done nothing wrong. That will be determined through proper investigation." His thin smile held no warmth. It was the smile of a man who had already determined the outcome and was simply going through the motions required to reach it. "Gather whatever you need. You may not be returning for some time." As the deputies escorted her across the ranch yard toward the waiting horses, Emiline caught a flicker of movement at the tree line. A shadow that might have been a deer stepping between the pines, or might have been something else entirely. She raised one hand to her chest, pressing her palm flat over the hidden document, and held it there for 3 full seconds. If Levi Hawthorne was watching from those trees, and she believed with every instinct she possessed that he would understand. He was a man who read signs the way others read books. He would know that her hand over her heart did not mean fear. It meant she was carrying something, something hidden, something that mattered more than anything she had ever held. They brought her to the Silver Creek Courthouse, a stone building hastily prepared for the judge's arrival, and locked her in a small, windowless room that smelled of dust and lamp oil and the stale despair of spaces where people had been kept against their will. "Make yourself comfortable," Drake said as the heavy door swung closed. "We will begin our conversation once the sun is fully up and my mind is fresh for such important work." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. This would not be a conversation. It would be an extraction. A process designed to produce whatever confession served his purposes, regardless of its relationship to truth. And when it was finished, the woman who had discovered his forgery and carried the evidence against her body would be silenced as permanently and as legally as her father had been. Alone in the darkness, Emiline pressed her back against the cold stone wall and felt the forged indictment crinkle against her ribs. The evidence of her father's innocence and Drake's guilt lay hidden against her skin, its presence both a comfort and a terrible danger. She possessed proof that could change everything. But she was locked in a cell by the very man that proof condemned, and the key was in his pocket, and the sunrise that was approaching would bring either vindication or destruction, and the distance between those two outcomes was measured in hours that she could not control. All she could do was trust. Trust that Levi had seen her signal. Trust that Silas would understand its meaning. Trust that somewhere in the darkness outside these stone walls, three mountain men who had chosen to stand between her and the world were already moving, already planning, already preparing to keep a promise that had been made by a dead man to a dead man, and had somehow, through the mysterious arithmetic of honor and love, and the stubborn refusal of good people to let evil have the final word, found its way to the living. Outside the cell, she could hear Drake's deputies settling into their positions for the night. Bootsteps on stone, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a coffee pot being set on a stove. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the end. The only question was whose end it would be. Levi Hawthorne had been watching from the tree line when they took her. He had returned from his trap line earlier than usual, guided by an instinct he had learned never to question. The same instinct that told him when a storm was coming, or when a predator was moving through the timber, or when the ground beneath his feet was about to shift in ways that could not be predicted by looking at the surface. He had crested the ridge above the ranch just as the riders appeared on the valley road, four armed men flanking a fifth, whose expensive black suit and silver hair were visible even at distance. And he had known immediately, with the cold certainty of a tracker reading a sign that admitted no alternative interpretation, that the thing they had been preparing for had arrived 2 days ahead of schedule. He watched from behind a stand of Douglas fir as they entered the ranch house. He watched as they brought Emiline out, her small frame wrapped in a shawl against the morning cold, her honey blonde hair loose around her shoulders, her chin raised with the fierce dignity of a woman who has decided that if she must be taken, she will not be dragged. And he watched as she pressed her hand flat against her chest and held it there 3 full seconds, a gesture directed at the tree line with the deliberate precision of someone sending a message they cannot speak aloud. Levi understood. He was a man who read the world through its silences rather than its noise, who tracked meaning through gesture and position, and the way a person holds their body when they are carrying something they cannot afford to reveal. Emiline was telling him that she had something hidden, something pressed against her ribs, something important enough to risk signaling its existence to anyone who might be watching from the shadows. He did not follow the riders into town. Following would accomplish nothing except revealing that the Hawthorne brothers were aware of the arrest, which would give Drake time to prepare for their response. Instead, Levi turned his horse toward the north pasture where Silas was checking the fence line and covered the distance at a pace that his horse would remember for weeks. Silas received the news the way a mountain receives lightning. The impact was absorbed into something so massive that its surface barely changed, but deep inside, in the places where rock meets fire, everything shifted. His amber eyes went flat. His jaw locked into a configuration that Levi recognized from their childhood, from the times when older boys in Silver Creek had made the mistake of targeting the youngest Hawthorne brother for harassment, and had discovered that Silas, even at 14, responded to threats against his family with a ferocity that left lasting impressions. "She touched her chest," Levi said. "Right over the ribs. She is carrying the forged indictment." Silas closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened them, the man who looked out was not Silas the rancher, not Silas the brother who had fallen in love against every principle of caution he possessed. This was Captain Silas Hawthorne, former United States Marshal, a man trained to assess threats and construct responses with the mechanical precision of a clock counting down to an hour that cannot be postponed. Find Wyatt, tell him everything. Then both of you meet me at old Zeke's cabin by sunset. I need allies, and that means having conversations I have been avoiding for 8 years. The cabin of Ezekiel Britter sat at the edge of Silver Creek like a memory that the town had decided to keep but not acknowledge. It was older than any other structure in the settlement, built from logs that had been cut when the valley still belonged to the elk and the eagles and the native peoples whose stone cairns Levi tended on the high meadow. Old Zeke himself was 83 years old, a former mountain man and fur trapper whose body had finally betrayed the spirit inside it, forcing him into a sedentary existence that he accepted with the philosophical resignation of someone who had always known that the mountains would outlast him. But his mind remained a weapon. He opened his door before Silas knocked, as if the vibration of approaching footsteps on his porch was all the announcement he required. "So," Zeke said, settling into his rocking chair with the careful movements of a man for whom every joint was a negotiation between will and pain. The judge finally overplayed his hand. "You knew about Drake?" "Son, I have been watching people come and go in this territory for longer than you have been breathing. You think I would not notice when a federal judge starts accumulating land and influence at exactly the rate a well-paid spy would manage?" His eyes, roomy but sharp as glass splinters, fixed on Silas with an intensity that belied his age. "The real question is what took everyone else so long to see it." What old Zeke told him over the next hour confirmed everything Silas had suspected and added dimensions he had not imagined. Drake's corruption extended back at least 15 years, predating the Cartwright gang's current incarnation by half a decade. The judge had been a facilitator of information theft since the early days of Montana's territorial government passing survey data, military intelligence, and settlement locations to whatever outlaw organization offered the highest price. He had survived this long, not through brilliance, but through the invisible protection that respectability provides, the armor of a title and a black robe, and the assumption so deeply embedded in the American consciousness that most people never think to question it, that the man sitting behind the bench must be the most trustworthy person in the room. Henry Whitfield was getting too close, Zeke said. As a federal surveyor, he handled the same kind of information Drake was selling. If Whitfield had ever compared his restricted reports against the intelligence the gangs were using, he could have traced the leak back to its source. Drake could not afford that. So he eliminated the threat and manufactured the evidence in one stroke. Framed an innocent man with the very crime Drake himself was committing. "Neat," Silas said, and the word carried no admiration. Only the cold recognition of a professional assessing another professional's work and finding it technically competent but morally abominable. "Neat, clean, and final, except for the daughter." Zeke leaned forward and his rocking chair creaked like a ship in rough water. "She is the one variable Drake could not control, smart like her father, observant like her grandmother, and now she is asking the right questions, and Drake needs to shut her down before those questions find answers he cannot survive. I will not let that happen. I know you will not, but wanting to save her and being able to save her are different things separated by the distance between a plan and a prayer." The meeting with Mayor Harlan Prescott took place that evening in the mayor's private study, a room that smelled of whiskey and lamp oil, and the unmistakable anxiety of a man who has been told that the foundation of his political career is built on sand. Prescott received Silas with the wary attention of someone who knows he is about to be presented with information that will require him to choose between comfort and conscience, and who has spent his entire career avoiding exactly that choice. "I know what you are going to say." Prescott began pouring whiskey with hands that trembled slightly. "And I want you to understand that when Whitfield was convicted, I had no reason to doubt the verdict. Drake's evidence was thorough. The witnesses were credible. The trial followed every proper procedure." "The trial was presided over by the man who manufactured the evidence," Silas replied. "Drake is the Cartwright gang's informant, Harlan. Has been for years. Henry Whitfield was framed, and now Drake is in our courthouse preparing to do the same thing to Emiline." What little color remained in Prescott's face departed. He set his glass down with a click that sounded in the quiet room like the cocking of a hammer. You took Whitfield's surveying contracts and land claims when he fell. Silas continued, and his voice carried no accusation, only the flat statement of facts that required acknowledgement before they could be addressed. If he was innocent, if you helped destroy an honorable man's family through your silence, through your willingness to profit from a tragedy you never questioned, because questioning it was inconvenient, then you owe his daughter whatever aid you can provide. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the candle on Prescott's desk to gutter twice. Then the mayor spoke, and his voice came out hoarse, as if the words had to fight their way past something lodged in his throat. What do you need? Access to Drake's quarters in the courthouse. 2 hours when his guards are elsewhere. And your testimony when the time comes about how certain people in this town moved to benefit from Whitfield's fall with a speed that suggested they knew the opportunity was coming before it arrived. Prescott closed his eyes. The expression on his face was that of a man stepping off a cliff and hoping without confidence that he will discover the ability to fly on the way down. Tomorrow night, Drake has scheduled a dinner with the town council to discuss the Cartwright threat. I will ensure it runs long. His quarters will be unguarded from 8 until midnight at the earliest. The operation unfolded with the quiet precision of three brothers who had spent their lives working together in coordination so deep that language was merely optional. Levi took the high ground. He positioned himself on the roof of the livery stable across from the courthouse, lying flat against the cedar shingles with the patience of a man who had once spent 11 hours motionless in a snowdrift, waiting for a mountain lion that was killing ranch calves. From his vantage point, he could see every approach to the building, every window, every shadow that moved against the walls. He communicated with his brothers using the bird calls he had learned from the crow trackers who had taught him woodcraft signals so perfectly mimicked that even the real birds sometimes answered. Wyatt stationed himself at the saloon adjacent to the courthouse, occupying a corner table with a whiskey he barely touched and a card game he was deliberately losing his easy laughter and engaging conversation, creating a sphere of distraction that would envelop anyone who entered the establishment. If a deputy or a townsperson wandered toward the courthouse unexpectedly, Wyatt would intercept them with the magnetism that made him impossible to walk past without stopping to exchange at least a few words. Silas entered through the service door that Prescott had left unlocked. He moved through the darkened courthouse with the trained silence of a man who had spent 4 years entering places where his presence was not authorized, and 2 more years tracking men who did not want to be found. Each step was deliberate, each breath controlled, each sense focused to a point so fine that he could hear the settling of the building's timbers and distinguish it from the breathing of a guard 2 rooms away. Drake's quarters occupied the 2nd floor. The locked chest sat beside the judge's desk, a heavy oak box bound with iron straps and secured with a combination lock that would have stopped most men. Silas was not most men. He produced a set of tools from an interior pocket, not the crude implements of a common thief, but the precision instruments of a trained investigator, and worked the lock with the patient focus of a surgeon. The mechanism yielded in under 4 minutes with a click that sounded in the silent room like a bone breaking. What he found inside broke something else entirely, letters written in a cipher that Silas recognized from intercepted Cartwright gang communications. A ledger recording payments received over 15 years, each entry annotated with cryptic notations that corresponded when cross-referenced against dates of known raids with devastating precision. Maps bearing federal survey markings overlaid with handwritten notes identifying weak points in settlement defenses and optimal timing for attacks. And a half-finished letter addressed to a Cartwright gang lieutenant, written in Drake's own meticulous hand, outlining the schedule for the next Army patrol rotation and identifying 3 settlements that would be vulnerable during a specific window the following month. But it was a single sentence in an older letter dated 3 weeks after Henry Whitfield's execution that made Silas grip the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned white. The Whitfield problem has been resolved. His execution removes the last person with sufficient knowledge to connect our operations to their source. Recommend we continue using his established methods as cover for ongoing intelligence transfer. Any future investigation will simply confirm what the court has already determined. Henry Whitfield's death warrant, written by the man who had signed his actual death warrant, confirming in his own handwriting that the conviction was manufactured, that the execution was murder, and that the ongoing raids were being deliberately designed to reinforce the false narrative of Whitfield's guilt. Silas photographed every document with a small camera and then took the originals. Evidence this important could not be left in the hands of the man it condemned. The three brothers reconvened at the thinking meadow under stars that looked close enough to touch. Levi spread his own contribution on the flat stone beside Drake's papers. During his perimeter checks over the previous weeks, he had followed the courthouse horse tracks not just to the main trail, but through a concealed route that led to a hidden cave on the backside of East Ridge. Inside that cave, he had found a supply cache for the Cartwright gang. Fresh provisions stamped with the federal courthouse commissary marks, ammunition in crates bearing military serial numbers, and most damning of all, a lockbox containing copies of the same coded correspondence found in Drake's chest. The cave is 3 miles from here, en mer, Levi said, his green eyes steady in the starlight. The supplies carry Drake's quartermaster stamps. The horse tracks run from the courthouse to the cave and back. The timeline matches the last 3 raids exactly. He looked at his brothers with the quiet certainty of a man who has followed a trail to its end and knows with absolute conviction what lies at the terminus. This is not circumstantial evidence. This is a supply chain, and it leads from Drake's door to the gang's operations without a single break in the links. "We have him," Wyatt said, and his voice carried none of its usual warmth. This was Wyatt, the former Army scout, the tactician who understood that evidence was only as valuable as the strategy used to deploy it. "We have him," Silas confirmed, "but we need to move before sunrise. Emiline has been in that cell for over 24 hours, and Drake does not need much more time than that to manufacture whatever confession he requires." The church bell of Silver Creek rang at dawn. Its deep iron voice rolled across the valley and up the mountainsides, echoing off the ridges and returning to the town like a sound that refused to be absorbed by distance or silence. It was the emergency bell, the one that had not been rung since the summer a wildfire threatened the settlement 4 years earlier, and its meaning was understood by every person who heard it. "Come now. Come to the hall. Something has happened that concerns everyone." The community hall filled quickly. 200 people arranging themselves on benches and chairs and along the walls with the nervous energy of a population that had learned to associate unexpected gatherings with bad news. Children were hushed. Dogs were shooed outside. The air inside the hall carried the compressed warmth of too many bodies in too small a space, underlaid with the sharp scent of anxiety, which smells if you have encountered it often enough to recognize it, like sweat and coffee and the metallic tang of adrenaline. Judge Cornelius Drake arrived with his 4 deputies, wearing the same immaculate black suit, in the same gold watch chain, and the same wire-rimmed spectacles he had worn the morning he arrested Emiline. But she noticed something she had missed before, or perhaps something that had not been there before. A tightness at the corners of his mouth, a stiffness in the way he held his shoulders. The posture of a man who has carried a heavy weight for so long that his body has forgotten how to stand without it, and who senses without yet understanding why that the weight is about to be removed. He had not yet returned to his quarters. He had not yet discovered that his chest had been opened and his records taken. He took the bench at the front of the hall with practiced authority, adjusting his spectacles and surveying the packed room with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who mistakes fear for respect because he has never encountered the genuine article. "Thank you, Mayor Prescott, for convening this assembly so promptly. The matter of the Whitfield woman's involvement in ongoing Cartwright operations should be resolved with efficiency. I have prepared formal charges that will demonstrate beyond question that the network established by her father remains active and that she is its primary operative." "Actually," said a voice from the back of the hall, and every head in the room turned with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds responding to a predator's shadow, "there are other matters to address first." Silas Hawthorne walked up the center aisle. He moved with the measured stride of a man who has calculated every step of what is about to happen and has accepted every possible consequence. He was not dressed in a rancher. The leather vest was gone, replaced by a clean shirt and a coat that he had not worn since the day he left the Marshal Service. On his chest, catching the light with the dull gleam of authority earned rather than assumed, was a badge. Not a current badge, not a symbol of active jurisdiction, but the badge of a United States Marshal carried for 4 years, across some of the most dangerous territory in the American West, and bearing the weight that comes from being worn by a man who had earned the right to carry it through service rather than appointment. Drake's composure cracked, not dramatically, not with the theatrical breakdown of a villain in a stage play, but Silas, who had spent years learning to read the micro-expressions of men who were trying to hide their true reactions, saw it. The slight widening of the pupils, the almost imperceptible tightening of the fingers around the gavel, the way Drake's tongue touched his lower lip in a gesture that meant in the vocabulary of involuntary tells that the mouth had gone dry. "Who are you, Uy?" Drake demanded, though his voice maintained its authoritative register through sheer force of a lifetime's practice. "My name is Silas Hawthorne. I served 4 years as a Deputy United States Marshal under Marshal James Wheeler, Montana Territory Division. I have spent the past several months conducting an investigation into ongoing treason connected to the Cartwright Gang's intelligence operations, and I have evidence to present that this assembly needs to hear before any charges are brought against Emiline Whitfield. You have no current jurisdiction, no authority to conduct investigations or present evidence in a federal proceeding. This is not a federal proceeding, Judge. This is a community hall, and I am not presenting evidence to a court. I am presenting it to the people of Silver Creek who have a right to know the truth about what has been happening in their territory and in whose name justice has been perverted." Silas's amber eyes swept the room, making contact with individual faces in the crowd. Old Zeke, sitting in the back row with his gnarled hands folded over the head of his walking stick, nodded once with the slow satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time for this moment. Nettie Dawson, holding the toddler that Emiline had treated for teething pain, leaned forward with an expression of fierce attention. Wyatt and Levi had positioned themselves at opposite sides of the hall, covering the exits, with the professional awareness of men who understood that cornered animals were the most dangerous kind. "6 months ago," Silas said, and his voice carried through the hall with the resonance of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where his words carried legal weight, "Henry Whitfield was convicted and executed for selling government intelligence to the Cartwright Gang. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Documents bearing his seal, witnesses who swore to his guilt, gold coins found in his office. Every piece fell into place with the precision of a mechanism designed by a skilled hand." He paused, letting the silence build. "Every piece of that evidence was forged." The hall erupted, not with words but with the collective intake of breath that occurs when 200 people simultaneously confront the possibility that something they believe to be settled is about to become unsettled in ways they cannot yet comprehend. Drake rose from his chair with a speed that betrayed the fear his voice was still trying to hide. "These are the ravings of a man with no authority and a personal interest in the accused. I will not permit this assembly to be hijacked by unfounded accusations against a sitting federal judge." "Then you will not object to having these documents examined." Silas turned to Mayor Prescott, who stepped forward carrying the leather satchel with the expression of a man who has finally chosen to pay a debt he has been carrying for 6 months. Prescott opened the satchel and began placing its contents on the table at the front of the hall. The letters, the ledger, the maps, the half-finished correspondence to the Cartwright lieutenant. Each document landed on the wood surface with the quiet finality of cards being laid face up in a game that was already over. "These materials were recovered from Judge Drake's personal quarters in this courthouse," Prescott said, and his voice wavered only once before steadying into something that resembled, for perhaps the first time in his political career, genuine courage. "They include 15 years of correspondence with outlaw organizations, records of payments received for intelligence provided, and detailed plans for future raids, including one that identifies 3 settlements for attack within the coming month." The crowd pressed closer, craning to see the documents, and the mood in the room shifted like weather changing on a mountain. The fear that had been directed at Emiline Whitfield for weeks began to rotate slowly, and then with increasing speed toward the man sitting behind the bench. "Forgeries," Drake said, but the word came out fractured, missing the conviction that had been its foundation for 15 years. "This is a conspiracy to undermine federal authority. I demand that these proceedings be halted immediately and that everyone involved in this farce be placed under arrest for obstruction of justice and theft of government property." "And the horse tracks," Levi Hawthorne's voice came from the side of the hall, quiet, but carrying the absolute clarity of a man who has never in his life spoken a word he could not prove. The ones I followed from your livery stable to the supply cave on East Ridge, the ones made by horses wearing the double clip pattern your personal farrier uses, the ones that match the timing of every raid in the past 3 months. Drake's face went the color of old ash. Or the supplies in that cave. Levi continued stepping forward with the easy confidence of a man presenting evidence that admits no contradiction. Provisions stamped with federal courthouse commissary marks, ammunition in military crates, all of it accessible by a trail that leads directly from your stables across Hawthorne land and into the mountains. I mapped every step. I recorded every shade, every sign, and the ground does not lie, Judge. It never has. It was at this moment that Emiline Whitfield spoke. She had been brought from her cell to witness what Drake had clearly intended to be her formal indictment. She stood between two deputies who were no longer certain whose orders they should be following, her navy blue dress wrinkled from a night on a stone floor, her honey blonde hair tangled from sleep. She had barely managed dark shadows beneath her cornflower blue eyes, testifying to hours of fear and sleeplessness. But when she stepped forward, the crowd parted before her, the way water parts before the bow of a ship, and something in the way she moved, something in the straightness of her spine and the set of her jaw, and the quality of determination that burned in those blue eyes, transformed her from a prisoner into something that no one in that hall would ever forget. I have something to say. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The hall had gone so quiet that the sound of the wind against the windows was audible, and every person in the room understood, without being told, that they were witnessing a moment that would be spoken about in Silver Creek for generations. "Before any more blood is shed in my name," she said, and each word fell into the silence with the weight of something that has been carried for a very long time and is finally being set down. "Let all truth be revealed." She reached inside her bodice and withdrew the oilcloth-wrapped document that had been pressed against her ribs for over 24 hours. The paper crackled as she unfolded it, its false seal and lying words exposed to the morning light streaming through the hall's windows. "This is the federal indictment that convicted my father," Emiline said, holding it high enough for the entire assembly to see. "The document that sent Henry Whitfield to the gallows. I have carried it since his death because I could not bring myself to destroy it, and I could not bear to read it, and I could not understand why the weight of it never lessened, no matter how many months passed." She moved to the table where Drake's recovered documents were spread and placed the indictment beside them with the precision of a woman laying the final piece in a puzzle she has been assembling in the dark. "Now I understand. The weight never lessened because the document is a lie." She pointed to the seal. "The federal eagle on this indictment bears 5 feathers on its left wing. The genuine federal seal bears 6. My father noticed this during his trial. He tried to tell his attorney. He tried to tell the court. No one listened. They called it the desperation of a guilty man." She pointed to the paper. "The watermark on this document uses olive branches instead of laurel, a substitution so subtle that it would escape anyone who had not spent years handling genuine federal documents. My father spent his career handling them. He knew the difference, and he died knowing it." Emiline turned to face Drake directly. The physical contrast between them was stark enough to carry its own narrative. The small woman in her wrinkled dress, her face marked by exhaustion and grief, in a fury so controlled it looked almost like calm. The tall man in his expensive suit, his distinguished features dissolving under the acid of exposure, his authority melting like snow in spring, because authority in the end is only as strong as the truth it stands on. "My father was Henry Whitfield, federal land surveyor for Montana Territory. He was an honest man who loved maps and loved his daughter and served his country with pride and precision for 20 years. He was not a traitor. He was murdered. Murdered by you, Judge Drake. Murdered to protect your own betrayal, to cover your own crimes, to silence the one man whose knowledge of federal documents was detailed enough to expose your forgeries." The words fell on the assembly like a verdict, and in the silence that followed, something broke inside the room. Not a physical thing, something larger. The collective assumption held for 6 months by an entire community that Henry Whitfield was guilty and that his daughter carried his shame like a disease. That assumption cracked down the middle and fell apart, and what it revealed underneath was not certainty, but horror. The horror of people realizing that they had participated in injustice. that their whispers and their turned backs and their crossed streets had been instruments of a cruelty they had not designed but had enthusiastically maintained. Drake made his final move. His hand went to the pistol holstered beneath his coat, a desperate gesture born not from courage, but from the panic of an animal that sees the trap closing and chooses violence over surrender. But three things happened in the space of a single heartbeat. Silas's hand closed over Drake's wrist with a force that made the bones grind. Wyatt stepped on between Drake and the crowd with his own weapon drawn and leveled. And Levi materialized at the side door, blocking the last exit, having circled the building with the silent efficiency of a predator that has been patient long enough. "Judge Cornelius Drake," Silas said, and his voice carried the formal cadence of a man who had spoken these words before in different rooms to different men, but never with this much personal investment in their meaning. "You are under arrest for treason against the United States of America, for the judicial murder of Henry Whitfield, and for conspiracy with the Cartwright gang." Drake's resistance collapsed. His shoulders dropped. His hand went limp in Silas's grip. The cold gray eyes behind the wire-rimmed spectacles lost their calculating sharpness and became, in the space of 5 seconds, the eyes of a man who has spent 15 years constructing a fortress of lies and has just watched it demolished by a woman with a piece of paper and the courage to hold it up to the light. The deputies, released from conflicting loyalties by the overwhelming weight of evidence, stepped forward to take custody of their former superior. But then Drake did something no one expected. He stopped, turned, looked at Emiline with an expression that was neither rage nor self-pity, nor the theatrical remorse of a man performing contrition for an audience. It was exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who has been carrying something heavy for so long that setting it down feels not like relief, but like the removal of the last thing keeping him upright. "My son," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "They killed my boy, 14 years old, caught in a raid on our homestead when the Army patrol was 3 days late getting there. 3 days. Because someone in the territorial government could not be bothered to maintain the schedule." His gray eyes fixed on Emiline, and in them she saw something that complicated her fury in ways she did not want and could not avoid. Pain. Genuine, bottomless human pain. "You think I started this way? You think I woke up one morning and chose to be this?" The hall was absolutely silent. Even the wind had stopped. Emiline looked at the man who had killed her father. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the people watching began to shift uncomfortably, because what was happening on her face was too private and too complicated for a public setting. She was not forgiving him. She was not absolving him. She was doing something more difficult than either of those things. She was acknowledging that the world was more complex than a simple story of good and evil, that damage creates damage, that pain transmits itself through human beings the way fire transmits itself through dry timber, leaping from one life to the next, destroying everything it touches without regard for the intentions of the people it burns. "I understand loss," Emiline said finally. "I know what it feels like to have the ground taken from beneath you and to spend every day after that falling. But your pain did not give you the right to kill my father." Drake did not answer. The deputies led him away, and the sound of his boots on the wooden floor faded into a silence that the crowd did not know how to fill. The weeks that followed moved with the purposeful velocity of justice that has been delayed too long and is trying to make up for lost time. Drake's confession, extracted under the weight of evidence so comprehensive that denial was no longer a viable strategy, revealed the full scope of a conspiracy that reached back 15 years. His personal ledger documented relationships with 3 separate outlaw organizations, each one cultivated and maintained with the careful attention of a businessman managing profitable accounts. Dozens of cases he had presided over were reopened. 3 men convicted on evidence Drake had manufactured were posthumously cleared of all charges. The Cartwright gang, deprived of their intelligence source, found their raids suddenly and catastrophically failing as Army patrols began appearing in places the gang had been told would be undefended, and within 2 months the organization was effectively dismantled. Henry Whitfield was officially exonerated by order of the territorial governor. The ceremony took place at Fort Ellis, the same parade ground where he had been hanged 6 months earlier. The same gallows still stood at the far end of the yard, its wooden frame weathered but not yet dismantled, and Emmeline refused to look at it because she understood with the hard-won wisdom of someone who has survived a wound that should have been fatal that acknowledging the instrument of destruction would give it power over the moment of redemption, and she was not willing to share this moment with anything that belonged to the past. A military officer in dress uniform presented her with her father's restored credentials. His surveyor's compass, its brass case polished to a gleam that caught the mountain sunlight. His official seal, the real one bearing 6 feathers on the left wing of the eagle. And a letter of commendation signed by the President of the United States acknowledging Henry Whitfield's faithful service and expressing the nation's regret for the miscarriage of justice that had ended his life. Emmeline held the compass in both hands and felt its weight and its coolness in the solidity of an object that had been important to someone she loved, and then she broke. Not the quiet tears she had shed in private during 6 months of enduring what should have been unendurable. This was different. This was the sound of a dam breaking 6 months of compressed grief and rage and loneliness and fear and stubborn, defiant hope, releasing simultaneously in a flood that her body could no longer contain. She cried the way rivers flood in spring, violently and completely, and without the slightest possibility of control, and the sound she made was not pretty or dignified or any of the things that polite society expects from a woman in public. It was raw, it was animal, and it was the most honest sound that anyone on that parade ground had heard in a very long time. Silas held her through it, his massive arms wrapped around her small frame like the walls of a fortress built for the specific purpose of keeping one person safe. His scarred hands cradled the back of her head with a tenderness that made several of the soldiers present look away, not from embarrassment, but from the intensity of witnessing something too private and too powerful for casual observation. Wyatt stood beside them, his easy charm replaced by a protective solemnity that transformed his face into something approaching sculpture. And Levi watched from a respectful distance, his green eyes carrying the quiet satisfaction of a tracker who has followed a trail through wilderness and storm and deception and has finally, at the end of it all, arrived at the place the trail was always leading. The people of Silver Creek responded to Emmeline's vindication in ways that were complicated and imperfect and deeply messily human. There were those who apologized immediately and sincerely. Nettie Dawson was the first arriving at the Hawthorne Ranch the morning after the trial with a basket of food and tears that left no room for doubt about their authenticity. Mrs. Calloway from the general store came next, her apology wrapped in the transparent fiction that she had always had her doubts about the verdict, which fooled no one but was accepted with a grace that Emiline had learned from her grandmother, who had always said that accepting a clumsy apology was more generous than demanding a perfect one. Virgil Crandall never apologized in words, but when his grandson developed a rattling cough that winter that Doc Harrigan could not ease, was Emmeline's door he knocked on at 3 in the morning, his hat in his hands, and his pride in his pocket, and his grandson wrapped in a blanket in his arms. Emiline treated the child without comment or condition, and Virgil stood in her kitchen with tears running down his weathered face and said nothing, because some debts are too large for language and can only be acknowledged through the simple act of showing up and trusting the person you once wronged to help you anyway. Edith Pemberton's transformation was the most dramatic. She arrived at Emmeline's door not with excuses, but with the unvarnished confession of a woman who had looked in the mirror and finally seen what was there. "I was cruel," Edith said, standing on the porch with her hands twisting her handkerchief into shapes that would never recover. "I was cruel because being cruel made me feel important, because judging someone else's family was easier than looking at the failures in my own. You did not deserve what I did, and I am not here because my husband told me to apologize or because the town expects it. I am here because I cannot live with myself unless I say the words out loud. I was wrong about everything." Emmeline took the older woman's trembling hands in her own. "Then we start over. That is what people do." Doc Harrigan, whose failing eyesight and trembling hands had made his practice increasingly uncertain, made Emiline a proposition she had not expected. He wanted her to take over as Silver Creek's primary healer, not as an assistant, not as a supplement to his own declining abilities, as his successor. "40 years I have been doctoring," Harrigan said, sitting in Emmeline's kitchen with a cup of the chamomile tea she had brewed for his arthritis. "And I have never seen anyone with your combination of knowledge and instinct and compassion. This town needs you, Miss Whitfield. I am too old and too stubborn to say it gracefully, so I will say it bluntly. You are better at this than I ever was. 6 months after Drake's trial, when the first wildflowers of spring pushed through the last of the winter snow, and the mountains shook off their white mantle and stood green against a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly, Emiline Whitfield and Silas Hawthorne were married in the Silver Creek Community Hall. The same room where Emiline had once sat alone, invisible and unwanted, now overflowed with wildflowers gathered by the settlement's children, and food prepared by women who had once crossed the street to avoid her, and the warm, complicated, imperfect love of a community that had learned at considerable cost the difference between judgment and justice. Emmeline wore a dress that the women of Silver Creek had sewn as a collective gift. White cotton with delicate blue embroidery that matched her eyes, simple and beautiful, in a way that belonged to the frontier, rather than to fashion designed not to impress, but to honor. Her honey blonde hair cascaded in loose waves past her shoulders, caught with the bone comb that Silas had bought for her at the silversmith's shop months ago, a small gift that had become precious beyond any calculation of its modest value, because it was the first beautiful thing anyone had given her, simply because they wanted to. Silas stood at the makeshift altar with his brothers flanking him, and the expression on his scarred face would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him during his years of wandering. The walls were down. The fortress was open. The man who had spent 8 years running from grief and guilt, and the memory of his mother's death and his father's loneliness, stood still at last, not because he had reached the end of his endurance, but because he had found something worth stopping for. Wyatt served as best man. His easy smile was back in place, but it carried a depth now that it had not been there before, the warmth of a man who had watched his older brother find the thing that Wyatt himself had lost, and had decided that his brother's happiness was reason enough to believe that the world, for all its cruelty, was not finished being generous. Levi stood beside Wyatt, his auburn hair catching copper highlights from the candles, his green eyes bright with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had known this was coming. Since the first morning, he watched Silas look at Emiline across the breakfast table and forget for 3 full seconds how to speak. The vows were simple. Frontier people do not decorate their promises with unnecessary words, because words on the frontier carry weight that cannot be wasted, and a promise made in plain language before witnesses is a contract that no court could make more binding than it already is. "With this ring," Silas said, and his rough voice filled the hall, the way his presence filled every room he entered, completely and without apology, "I bind my life to yours, my honor to yours, my future to yours. I promise to protect you, to trust you, and to remind you every day that you are worth more than you know." "With this ring," Emiline replied, and her voice was steady and clear, carrying the strength of a woman who has been through fire and has discovered that fire, while it destroys many things, also forges some things into shapes that are stronger than they were before. "I offer my heart, my strength, my healing hands, and all the love I have to give. I promise to be your partner, your truth teller, and your safe harbor when the storms come." The rings were simple gold bands, unadorned and unembellished, engraved on the inside with 5 words that only they would ever see. The best things usually are. When they kissed gently and briefly with the tender restraint of 2 people who understood that what lay ahead of them was worth more than any single moment could contain. The cheer that rose from the assembled guests shook dust from the rafters. But for Emiline and Silas, the sound faded to a distant warmth as the world narrowed to the space between them, a space that had once been filled with secrets and suspicion, and the painful distance between 2 people who wanted to trust each other but did not know how, and was now filled with nothing but the simple, staggering, everyday miracle of being known and loved and chosen. Later, as the celebration continued inside the hall, Emiline and Silas stepped out onto the porch. Their porch, the place where their story had really begun, not with a dance or a letter or a forged seal, but with 2 lonely people sitting in the dark and discovering that loneliness shared is not loneliness at all. The mountains stood against the sunset like sentinels, their peaks carrying the last gold of the dying day. The air smelled of pine and wildflowers and wood smoke from the hall's chimney, and from inside came the sound of a fiddle playing a melody that seemed to have been composed for exactly this moment, slow and sweet, and full of the beauty that exists only in things that have been earned rather than given. "Having second thoughts?" Silas asked. His arm was around her waist. Her head rested against his chest, and she could hear his heartbeat steady and strong and real. Never. She tilted her face up to look at him, and the smile she wore was not the fragile, cautious thing it had been in the early days. It was full and fierce and unafraid. Though I still cannot quite believe this is real. It is real as Drake's prison cell, as real as your father's restored name. He drew her closer. A year ago, I was a man with no home and no purpose beyond the next tree, and no belief that anything worth keeping could survive the kind of life I had been living. Then I walked across a dance floor and said 4 words, ooh, a woman I had no right to speak to and no ability to walk away from. Act like you are with me. Best lie I ever told. Turned out to be the truth before I finished saying it. 1 year later, a late summer morning, when the light was golden and the air tasted of warm grass, and the mountains wore their green with the pride of peaks that have survived another winter and intend to survive 1,000 more. Emiline stood on the porch of the expanded Hawthorne ranch house, watching the sun pour into the valley like honey spilling from a jar. In her arms, a newborn slept. A boy with his father's amber eyes and his mother's fair skin, wrapped in a quilt that the women of Silver Creek had pieced together from fabric contributed by every family in the settlement. Each square a different color and a different pattern, forming a whole that was more beautiful than any of its parts, because it represented something that could only be created collectively. Silas emerged from the barn, crossing the yard in long strides, with a smile on his scarred face that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him during his years of wandering. Levi followed at a measured distance, carrying the morning's eggs in a basket that he held with the careful attention he gave to all fragile things. And Wyatt was in town because Nettie Dawson, the young mother whose toddler, Emiline, had treated for teething pain a lifetime ago, had been looking at Wyatt with an expression that Emiline recognized very well, the look of a woman discovering that the man she had been politely ignoring for months was actually the most interesting person she had ever met. "Good morning, Mrs. Hawthorne," Silas said, bending to press his lips against Emiline's forehead and then against the impossibly soft head of their sleeping son. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne. Former Marshal Hawthorne, if you please. Retired permanently. Until the next crisis. There will not be a next crisis. I intend to spend the rest of my life doing nothing more dangerous than arguing with the cattle and losing arguments to my wife." Below them, Silver Creek was waking, smoke curling from chimneys, children running toward the schoolhouse, the church bell marking the hour with the same iron voice that had once summoned the town to witness the beginning of the end for Judge Cornelius Drake. On the hill above the ranch, the ancient stone cairns of Levi's thinking meadow caught the morning light, their weathered surfaces carrying stories that stretched back centuries and would stretch forward centuries more long after the names of everyone in this valley had been forgotten, and the dramas that had seemed so enormous and so permanent had dissolved into the deep, patient memory of the mountains. Emiline touched the small gold locket around her neck, the one that had belonged to Silas's mother, and now held a tiny photograph of their son, and felt the last traces of the old fear dissolve. Not with a dramatic release or a cathartic flood or any of the spectacular emotional events that make good stories, but poor descriptions of actual healing. It dissolved the way morning mist dissolves. Slowly, quietly, without announcement or fanfare, simply gone, replaced by warmth and light and the ordinary, extraordinary reality of being alive and being loved and being exactly where she was always meant to be. She was home, she was known, she was healed. And the story of her life, which had once seemed like a tragedy with no final act, turned out to have been a love story all along. One that began with 4 words spoken by a scarred stranger in a crowded hall, and that would continue chapter by chapter, day by ordinary day, for as long as the mountains stood and the wildflowers grew, and 2 people who had found each other in the darkness continued to choose every morning to walk together into the light.